Good morning and welcome everybody to our workshop on food and identity in South Asia since independence, or Indian independence, I should say. My name is James Staples. I'm an anthropologist here at Brunel, University London, and also the leader presently of our South Asia Studies research group. Now, if everything works as it should, we should have all our speakers and panel chairs on Zoom, and other participants who have registered with us on Eventbrite joining us on the live stream on YouTube. So hopefully you can if you can hear me, everything is working. Now, one of the impetuses for this workshop was the setting up of an informal UK South Asia network, for which we have to thank Dr. Nilanjan Sarkar, who's Deputy Director of the South Asia Centre at the LSE, which invited its members to organise events to coincide with the 75th anniversary of Indian independence, which is this year. Now, the particular themes of these events has been left entirely to those organising them, with the caveat that work from more than one country in the region should be included in any event. And I think this is probably as a way of overcoming the dominance of India in South Asia at the expense often at other countries in the region. And thanks, at least in part, to Professor David Gellner at Oxford, who was very helpful in publicising our event to our workshop to scholars who are working in Nepal through various networks. I'm pleased to say that in addition to abstracts rooted in field work all across India, we also had a really good showing from Nepal. And we also had work actually on a number of marginalized areas within India itself, including the Northeast and Kashmir, which you'll be hearing about later. Now, the workshop is also one of a number of events that we've hosted this year as Brunel's South Asia Research Studies Group. Sorry, a bit of a long title there, BSARSG. Is our acronym, which is a group that we set up less than a year ago, in part to provide a research base for some of the cutting edge South Asia specific programs and teaching that we're doing and that we're leading on here at Brunel. So in addition to content in our undergraduate programs in anthropology, which is where I'm located, and PhD students, we're also looking to launch a new master's program in Global South Asia Studies in 2024, next year. So if there's anybody listening out there who's interested in that, please do get in touch without any obligation. You can also follow us on Twitter, which is where we'll publicize these kinds of things. You'll find us at Brunel South Asia, and that's where we promote all of our events. So watch that space for things to come. We've had a number of events already. We've had film screenings, we've had roundtables. There will be other things, both online and face-to-face. We've also been part of the Brunel Research Festival 2023, which is going on at the moment. We've coincided with that, so we've sort of been co-opted also into that program. And the Brunel Research Festival is a month-long celebration of, I suppose, the diverse local and global benefits and impacts of the research done by the university, not just in anthropology and in the social sciences, but right across the spectrum, including engineering and so on. So if you're interested in any of those things, please do check out the university's website. And yeah, I'm grateful to them for having publicized this event as well there on Brunel's own website. But the idea for this particular workshop also comes from discussions that I've been having with my South Asianist colleagues, particularly in anthropology and in development studies, all of whom have an interest to a greater or lesser extent in food. Certainly, we've all been very committed to having our lunchtime planning meetings over masala dosas in a restaurant in the Uxbridge Road, which I guess is also a dish made of something which has been fermented. And fermentation, I noticed, crops up in several of our papers today, actually, and perhaps we'll get to talk a bit about why that might be so later on. And food seemed to us to be a particularly pertinent theme. And we've said this also in our call for papers, which certainly those of you who are presenting will have seen, because food security and malnutrition have remained a very significant concern across the region over the last 3/4 of a century. So despite 75 years of independence, those things still remain quite prominent. And in some ways, with the climate emergencies that are now engulfing the planet and other crises such as COVID, which has certainly had an impact on food distribution systems, and again, this comes up, I think, in one of the papers that we have today, these issues are now more pressing than ever. But food and drink and all the practices associated with food and drink, what are sometimes referred to in food studies as foodways, and that encompasses sourcing food, potentially growing food, it encompasses preparation, styles of eating, as well as the food itself and what food might stand in for, what food might mean. Foodways are important for other reasons as well. And I think as the papers that make up this workshop testify, we've got 16 of them that are going to be presented today, food both shapes and is shaping of different regional identities. And food also marks out differences between and within communities across the region. So the study of foodways in South Asia helps us to understand the intersecting hierarchies of gender, of region, caste, class, and religious communities, but it also shows us how these identities are changing. And that often happens in complex ways. And again, I think that this will come out in several of the papers that we're going to have presented today. I'm not going to anticipate what our speakers are going to say. I've had the pleasure, as have my fellow chairs, in reading drafts of some of these papers before. So you're in for a treat. But we've divided them into 4 panels, slightly arbitrarily. There are several papers that could go in other panels, but we had to organize it some way. And we've entitled these panels, well, the first one is called Encountering Modernity, Food in a Liberalizing South Asia, which is going to be chaired by my colleague, Dr. Luke Heslop, who is an anthropologist who's worked in Sri Lanka, also in the Maldives. Then we have Putting Hunger Aid and Food Shortages in Context. Sorry, that was my title, a rather cumbersome one, but hopefully the papers that we've put into that panel do what it says on the tin, which my colleague Devanshi Chanchani, Dr. Devanshi Chanchani, is chairing. She's a development studies scholar, and she's worked on projects across India. And these are the 2 panels for this morning, each of which have 4 speakers on who will be introduced by the chairs when we get to them. Then this afternoon, after lunch, or whatever that will be for those of you in Korea and India and other parts of the world, probably late into the night, apologies for that. The third panel is Resistance and Beyond, Eating at the Margins, which is being chaired by my colleague, Dr. Peggy Floor, also a social anthropologist who works with Adivasi communities and with Christian communities in central India, in Chhattisgarh, or near Chhattisgarh, sorry, in Chhattisgarh. And the final panel of the day, which I'm chairing, we've entitled Migration, Food and Identity, which is obviously about, we look at peoples from South Asia in the diaspora, but also internal migrations within parts of India, for example, from the northeast to Delhi, which is chaired by me. I'm also an anthropologist, also at Brunel, and my own field work has been in South India, largely in a leprosy colony, but I've also done work in Hyderabad, which is now in Telangana. Now, we'll have an opportunity for questions and for comments at the end of each panel. So if everything works as it should, we should have about an hour in total of presentations, which leaves half an hour for the chair and discussant to sum things up a bit, to perhaps ask some initial questions, and then for the floor to be open for participants also to join in. So if you're in the Zoom room, you'll just have to raise your virtual hand, and we'll see it and we'll call you to be able to ask that question. That's the participants, that's the other speakers at this workshop. If you're following on the live stream on YouTube, you can ask questions and you can make points, give feedback, hopefully constructive feedback in the comments box at any time. And one of us will be keeping an eye on those at all times, and we'll make sure that the chair gets those questions, and that we'll hopefully be able to answer as many of them as we can. Now, before I hand over to Luke to chair the first panel, which hopefully we'll be able to start slightly earlier than the 9:30 advertised time, which gives us a bit of time if anything slips slightly, but we will be keeping a very tight rein on timing. I just had a few thank yous lest I forget at the end. Firstly to Nilanjan Tharkar. I don't know if he's still listening in at this point, but thanks to him for organising the network, but also for doing a great deal of work in sorting out all the logistics, including the YouTube links and so on. To my student Nafisa Hussain, who's one of our interns, and she's received and ordered all the papers so that I didn't lose any. And some of you will have been in touch with her, and she's put them all into a Dropbox for her. So yeah, she's done a great job. Obviously, thanks to all of the speakers, and many of you, most of whom got your papers to us in time or had very good reasons when they were slightly late. So thank you for doing that, which has been a great help and hopefully will enrich our discussions later on. And of course, to my colleagues, Peggy, Luke and Devanshi, for helping to organise this workshop and for the great intellectual contributions that they've made already to it. Now, an advantage, I guess, of having an online workshop, in addition to the obvious fact that it makes it open to anyone, wherever you are in the world, if you're willing to get up at a ridiculous hour in the morning or stay up very late at night. Another advantage is that I don't have to tell you where the fire escapes are or give you safety advice on how to evacuate if there's a fire, which hopefully there won't be. But on housekeeping, in the Zoom room, I'll ask everyone, apart from those who are members of the panel, to keep their cameras switched off, except in the Q&A sessions. And for all of us to keep ourselves muted when we aren't speaking. And if we are speaking, to have things like our email turned off so we don't get the beeps. Okay, so that's the housekeeping stuff sorted out. I'm really looking forward to hearing all the papers today. So over now to Luke Heslop to introduce to us the first panel.
Thank you, James.
Luke, over to you.
Thank you, James. And welcome all to the first panel of the day, Encountering Modernity, Food in a Liberalizing South Asia. So in this panel, we've got 4 papers. We are going to do them in the order as advertised. So we're going to start with this. We have Suchi Chattopadhyay from Krea University, India. We've got, sorry, Dr. Suchi, I should say now. Professor Kiranmayi Bhushi from Indira Gandhi National Open University. And we have Simiran Lalvani from the University of Oxford. And we have Dr. Thomas Herzmark from our very own Brunel University, London. So, as James has said, I'd invite all panelists to turn off their microphones when not speaking and have your PowerPoints ready, because you'll be the co-host to deliver it. So we're going to hear from our speakers, who will speak for no more than 15 minutes before moving into the questions and discussions, all of them together, and then do the questions and discussions together. And we're going to begin with Suchi, whose paper is entitled Eating to Learn of Aspirations and Fine Dining in a Globalized Delhi. So Suchi, please do turn on your camera and take it away.
Thank you, Luke. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining from different time zones. And my name is Suchismita, Suchi, and the paper that I'm presenting today is titled as Eating to Learn of Aspirations and Fine Dining in Globalized Delhi. So I'll begin with a vignette from my fieldwork in 2019. So in 2019, I received a WhatsApp text inviting me to an afternoon tea, the elegance of the most beautiful of the English culture, as you can see from the image on your left. So this text was sent to me by Asha, who calls herself an image architect. The 3-hour workshop on tea drinking and its appreciation was going to be held at a well-known 5-star hotel in the city of Delhi. Now, there were 12 women attending the high tea workshop. Most of the women in the group knew each other and hailed from the rich business families of West Delhi and were primarily homemakers in their middle age. At the workshop, we learned about the history of the English tea or the English high tea, different kinds of tea, the various blends, the equipment needed, how to brew tea, and how brewing was the correct technique of drinking tea as opposed to the Indian way of stewing the leaves. We were further instructed on the do's and don'ts of tea etiquette. For instance, it was very important to stir one's tea noiselessly by moving the tea in a small arch back and forth without clinking the spoon on the sides of the cup. Asha peremptorily informed us that we ought to never slurp the tea. This was a habit apparently Indians were prone to do. The women present at the workshop had many queries, ranging from how to brew the different blends of tea to what a tea infuser was and how the Chinese gaiwan worked, which is like an all-in-one contraption which has the teacup, the saucer, and the infuser. Now, the items were passed around with considerable interest for all of us to examine, including a tea cozy, which was initially mistaken to be an oven glove. Asha elucidated the correct manner in which one should be serving tea, how to drink tea, that is to not look into and not look over your cup, how to proceed with the 3-tiered arrangement of savory and sweet accompaniments. At the afternoon workshop, what impressed the participants most were the 3-tiered stands and the paper doilies that were used for the food. I feel like I'm in a London, Paris type of place, exclaimed one of the participants as all of them looked highly pleased and excited when the waiter placed the bone china and the ceramic stands on the table. It was an expansive menu consisting of smoked salmon and cucumber sandwich, honey glazed and emmental sandwich, chicken and cheddar, cucumber and mint sandwich, grilled vegetables and pesto croissant, and tomato and feta sandwich. Now, the dessert section also included pastries, traditional vanilla scones with creme chantilly, tea cakes, and cookies. Now, please bear with me. My intention is not to make anyone hungry in this panel or whoever is attending, but I do have a larger point in listing out this elaborate spread. Now, Asha was an etiquette and soft skills coach at a finishing academy for elite women that prided itself in providing the women of Delhi a Swiss-style finishing and taught them how to be ladylike. As Asha taught one of the participants how to eat a croissant with cutlery, the women around me kept remarking how it was important to keep updating oneself. The workshops, according to the participants, were deemed much better than spending time shopping or mindlessly watching TV at home. One of them also added that the workshop was an important place to become knowledgeable about foreign food, and thus, the next time she would be in a similar posh place, she would be prepared to express her preferences rather than resorting to milk tea and fritters. The afternoon high tea workshop, modeled on the lines of quote-unquote English culture, is a part of this burgeoning self-improvement/grooming industry of Delhi. I use grooming schools as a shorthand for the number of privately owned institutes that have mushroomed in the city and other parts of India since the early 2000s. Grooming schools teach embodied expressions of professionalism and upward mobility via lifestyle and social skills. Now, they are a dispersed market and they exist in the name of, say, spoken English classes, personality development courses, image management, and etiquette lessons. Grooming schools in Delhi promise people a polished transformation and the production of new subjectivities via language, soft skills, bodily practices, and appearance management. Specifically, they include soft skills and they include training in soft skills and social and dining etiquette, which includes like how to use cutlery, oenology, a knowledge of different international cuisines, and the know-how to organize and throw cocktail and dinner parties. So now in this paper, I focus on how foreign food and dining etiquette are projected as markers of an aspirational and a seemingly global urban lifestyle in the city, which must be actively learned. I will be dwelling on specific sessions on dining etiquette and practices from a couple of grooming schools to examine how food and modes of eating are carefully curated to be showcased as part of this new upper middle class Indian identity. So in the first section, aspiring to be global, I will very briefly lay out the context. Now, the current eating out and dining culture of urban India, especially Delhi, is a result of the processes of liberalization and globalization of the economy that were initiated in 1991. Now, the economic reforms paved way for an upper caste, English-educated middle class with new career opportunities, disposable income, and new lifestyles with material wants and desires. The state and media campaigns of the 1990s and 2000s depicted the route to a consumable modernity via the practices of globalization. Now, it is in this backdrop of a rapidly globalizing India in the 2000s that the Delhi Development Authority pursued its ambition of turning Delhi into a world-class city. Now, the Delhi's new world-class spaces of employment, pleasure, and consumption in the form of new cultures of work, prioritizing affective and aesthetic labor, shopping malls, and gourmet restaurants demand new modes of belonging. Now, a liberalized India witnessed rising numbers of gourmet, high-end, and concept restaurants, upscale pubs, cafes, and baristas, and new fast food chains targeting the upwardly mobile middle class and the urban and the semi-urban youth. Food and experiencing different cultures of eating were essentially marketed by brands and the media as the immediate indicator of an urban and a globally familiar subject. Now, restaurants are spaces of identity, performance, and articulation. Consumers' class identities are articulated via the food and the interaction with the corresponding commodities and space. So that is table manners, the proper use of cutlery, and the knowledge of flavor combinations and taste are the registers by which the body denotes class, caste, habitus, and other forms of identity. Now, however, none of these skills of taste and modes of belonging are innate or naturally given, be it the idioms of fine dining as forms of consumption and pleasure or as codes of professionalism. So according to instructors like Asha, belonging lies in speaking the right language, which is invariably English, appearance, body language, soft skills, and social and dining etiquette. In this context, body work is crucial to embody a global urbane disposition. Table manners, dining etiquette, and a general appreciation of international cuisine found their way in one form or the other into the many modules in personality development courses and image management. For instance, Asha stated that her finishing academy started offering lessons in oenology and cookery classes for Thai, Mexican, Lebanese, and Italian cuisine to its women clients for primarily two reasons. First, to familiarize women with new tastes as they sought to partake in the sights of a globalized Delhi, and second, to play the role of what they called an updated wife who would keep up with her husband's professional lives, and that included entertaining clients outside of the office space. My final section is titled as Eating to Learn and Unlearn, where I unpack these two categories, and Eating to Learn is also the title of my paper. Now, restaurants are gastronomical theaters for the performance of taste and knowledge. Thus, it is also a space that invites judgment, causing apprehension and anxiety. Now, this was most visible in a personality development course where table manners were being taught to a group of aspiring youth from middle-income families looking to join the corporate and the service industry. Now, over the course of a Chinese meal, the personality development instructor took the class to the art of eating with chopsticks and the right usage of a fork, spoon, and a knife. Now, for the first time, the class was visibly self-conscious and was making minimal eye contact. Many frowned in concentration as their chopsticks kept slipping, and the frustration of the class was increasingly visible as they tried to hold their forks gently and not look like they were clutching it. Now, one mildly exasperated student asked the instructor as to the purpose of eating using all the equipment when clearly he was unable to enjoy the food and was longing to eat with his hand. The instructor promptly responded that the student was free to eat, however, at his home, but in a formal setting or in a fancy restaurant, he would be harshly judged as someone with zero exposure to the world. Moreover, the instructor advised the class that willingness to experiment with food and new dining practices indicated a global persona who could be at home anywhere in the world. Now, thus eating was also a manner of learning to aspire for new social lives that were seemingly urbane and global. But eating is also an exercise in unlearning and capturing the unfamiliar. The high tea workshop, by teaching the participants the correct technique to brew, serve, and drink tea, served as a lesson in unlearning previous habits of consuming tea. Tea was introduced in the workshop as an event that had historical precedence, Victorian in this case. Moreover, it was referred to as a practice of elegance from another culture that could be learned and consequently performed as a lifestyle event. The workshop at one level, with its emphasis on how to brew black tea and how to use a tea infuser, might appear self-evident to some. Now, it might also appear surprising that this is also taking place in a culture that is literally like steeped and stewed in tea. Like to begin with, like the various forms, tea in its varied forms has been a part of the Indian subcontinent since the colonial period. So in the hierarchy of making tea, brewing black tea is probably the most basic when compared to how you need to be skilled when you're making, say, a masala chai or a masala tea or something called something that is popular in the Himalayan subcontinent, which is the butter tea, right? But the workshop was not about the most familiar. It was presented as a lesson in appreciating and capturing the aura of the unfamiliar Victorian high culture with its high tea culture, with its many accompaniments. Additionally, many of the participants were also trying some of the food for the first time. Now, the workshop sought to introduce new tastes and the accompanying etiquette of what to wear and how to consume the food item, including the kind of conversation one should have in a high tea setting. And the grooming schools aim to update and upgrade their clients that cannot be gained by mere economic wealth. So palate education via lessons in dining and oenology serve as crucial sites to understand the tacit codes of belonging, capital, and upward mobility. In conclusion, this paper uses grooming institutions to document the formation of an upper middle class Indian identity that is seemingly based on the presumed aesthetics of a global lifestyle. Fine dining and its corresponding etiquette serve as the registers of class visibility. While grooming institutions and their emphasis on dining etiquette are part of a hyper-visible and a hyper-aesthetic economy, it is also significant to account for the pleasurable dimensions of these classes. Compared to lectures on attitudinal training and deportment, it is the lessons in dining etiquette that generated the maximum attention, despite initial misgivings and hesitation. The lessons mark the concept, experience, and practice of dining and its etiquette as something that is desirable. So a humble cup of tea, when served with scones and clotted cream, assume a refinement that was no longer desi or vernacular, but global and thereby aspirational and supposedly bewitching. Thank you, and this is where I conclude my paper. I hope I kept to time. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suchi. That was fantastic, and you were perfectly in time. Not to worry at all. So next we have Simiran, who is giving us a paper entitled "How Platforms Cook for and Cook Up the World." So Simiran, please turn on your camera and microphone and take it away.
Sorry, Luke, I think next is Kiranmayi.
That is, of course, correct. Thank you. Thanks, Peggy. Yeah, so let me go again. I started at the wrong point. Next, we've got Kiranmayi, Professor Bhushi from the Indira Gandhi National Open University, giving us a paper entitled Biscuits and Cake, Commensality and Reconfigured Ideas of Purity and Pollution in a Himalayan Village. So apologies, Karen, please turn on your camera and mic and take it away.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to the workshop, and gives me an opportunity to air some of my yet to be fully formed ideas. So I take you away from a very urban setting to a rural area. My paper, which is titled Biscuits and Cakes, that's the modern part of it, Commensality and Reconfigured Ideas of Purity, Pollution, draws mainly from my long interaction in a village in Kumaon Hills, which is in the central Himalayas. The village is really tiny, and I'll get into more details, but let me start as to a little bit of the background as to why I thought I should do this paper. Give me a second, please. The explicit way in which Dalits have questioned the dominant Hindu dietary imposition and prescriptions by organizing beef festivals is just one of the registers of how food prescriptions are at the root of caste distinctions. While the beef eating issue was pushed into the public arena all too often, the everyday articulations of food prescriptions framed by Hindu notions of purity and pollution elude us as being of no consequence or fast disappearing. Now, I had a very strange experience where I invited a few of my neighbors to, well, not so strange, I suppose, to a small feast, which was to give thanks to some of the people who were involved in construction. So I called my neighbors too, who were part of this team. And when I went to invite my neighbor, he asked me if the food that is being served was going to be cooked by a Brahmin. Till such time, I didn't really think who was going to cook the food, because I rarely think about these things. And he also, very stridently put forth that he was from a Rajput caste, and so therefore will not eat anything if it is not cooked by a Brahmin or of the same caste. At which point, of course, I re-looked at my feasting situation. This little encounter really made me think whether caste distinctions based on food have really disappeared, because I lived in an urban setting and I rarely come across these kind of voicing, such strident voicing. So I decided to take a closer look at the idea of purity and pollution, which inform the articulations of distinction between caste and, of course, with its intersectionalities on ethnicity and gender. Purity and pollution, as Chattopadhyay observes, is the semiotic ideas of rank and distance. And those ideas are even more present in a caste situation, and there are numerous ways in which they keep coming up in conversations, in practices, and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into all the details of what purity and pollution entail, but very quickly, I just want to take a quick peek at what some of the significant features of purity and pollution notions, which inform a lot of eating habits in India. Some of you are familiar with these notions, but some of you may not be. So very quickly, I'll just go into these details. There is the concept of kacha and pakka food. Pakka food is basically food which is pure. Typically, it is well-cooked food, mostly deep fried, and fried with ghee is exalted. It's rarely considered polluting. Food cooked by Brahmins is also not polluting. Pakka food would mean a series of items, so it could be fried food, it could be sweets, it could be, it could also be cooked by Brahmins. More details will come as I talk about the situations that I've encountered. On the other hand, you have kacha food, which is basically food cooked in water, salt. And the literal meaning of kacha would be unripe. So in many ways, it's ill-formed, not perfect, and not pure. These are some of the fundamental ideas, but whenever we talk about commensality, or anthropologists and sociologists want to look at commensality, we often think of few central ways in which we navigate this terrain. One is to look at the kind of food that is being referred to as pure or impure, the preparation or the style of cooking, and also the sharing. Who sits with who when eating, what kind of situations entail, which kind of ranks to sit together. These are all the concerns which occupy many of the people who practice these notions around commensality, especially in a caste setting. Food left after eating on the plates would be considered highly polluting, called juta in North India, and there are different terms for it in South India. And such food cannot be handled by anyone except the person who's eating it, or has to be cleared by somebody from a lower caste or workers in an urban setting. Water can also be defiled and polluted. And if you are familiar with the caste system, I think you should know by now that one of the untouchability arises from this notion of pollution coming from water. And so many of them are not allowed into wells. But in the Kumaon context, this doesn't apply because most of the water is considered non-stationary or not still. So anybody can have access to water. These are some of the concerns which have been the defining features of commensality in a caste system. And there have been many writings on it. In fact, I believe in the 50s and 60s, when village studies were very popular in the Indian sociological context and anthropological context, there have been many studies on caste as an interactional system and not an attributional system, which was popularized by the likes of Dumont and others. So when trying to understand interactional system of caste, commensality became a very important area of study. And I think a lot of studies which either address commensality directly or indirectly were actually trying to establish caste system as an interactional system, and that there is no fixed kind of a template or a logic to it, and that it was very contextual. While this contextuality, it comes through in many of the papers, one thing is clear though, that the distinctions between the upper caste and the lower caste and the many in between castes is still clearly marked out, even more so in rural areas. And the notions are changing though. In fact, scholars who've been working on interdining or food and related things among the in caste studies have pointed out to the class aspirations as slowly transforming eating habits as well as interdining practices. We have a whole range of people who've said, for instance, Shet says that ritual instances have definitely decreased because of classization of caste. Staples, for instance, James writes, from his fieldwork in Bethany in Andhra, he says, the mimicry of urban middle-class culinary practices enable the lower caste to negotiate their relative status. Gopal Guru, who writes extensively on caste system and identities, also is of the opinion that marginality as such is not the main discourse that is figuring in caste scholarship now, and a lot of it centers around politics that have to do with representational politics of Indian democracy. And in any case, there are huge intersectionalities between among castes and between castes. So it's not to say that a Dalit from urban middle class will face the same kind of distance and ranking as perhaps the person would face in a rural setting. So it is changing. And as I mentioned earlier, that studies on rural areas have become few and far. And most of the studies on food and consumption seem to revolve somehow around just 1 second. Revolve around urban settings, and we've just heard a paper on class aspirations and the embodied practices. Very rarely we turn our attention to rural areas, and it has partly to do with the fact that the village as a unit seems to have somehow disappeared from from the fieldwork arena, because I think a lot of fieldwork continues to concentrate on the idea of a circumscribed area, and the village in itself has changed over the years. The urban inroads, the market and mediated practices have clearly taken the idea of the village unit away from scrutiny. So in many ways, people have started to say that the urban has seeped into the rural, and the practices that we often associate with the rural areas have diminished. So much so, Dipankar says, I think we need to call the rural person urban, denoting a sort of a urban-ness in the way they practice. He even says that the traditional notions have practically disappeared. Well, they haven't really, as I discover in my long interaction in my village. I'm calling it my village because I happen to have a part residence there, and I go there often, and I happen to engage a great deal with the village folk there, and it's a small village of about maybe 150 households. I haven't done an actual enumeration, but I have a clear idea, more or less, of the number of households, and there are about 2,000 people in all. When I first started to interact, I think I was the only person from Delhi. In the last 5 years or so, there's an increasing number of people from surrounding areas, mostly Delhi, especially during COVID, when people have discovered that it was easier to live in the mountains with fresh air, and there were fewer cases of COVID. And so there's a sudden influx of people from the urban Delhi to these areas, and many people have bought houses and have actually started to live there. So in the village, you have three predominant communities, caste communities, that is the Rajputs and the Brahmins and the Dalits. And my first few years were very magical, in the sense I felt that the community was, quote unquote, a pastoral idyll. Everything was done together, at a community level. So we had several festivals which are very native to this area and peculiar to this area. And in all these celebrations, the village came together, and I saw a lot of interaction between villages, and I assumed it was one of those villages which worked like a community. On closer examination, I found that there are tacit rules on who can interact with who and how, and especially when it came to eating. In many areas, these interactions have become more secular, but when it comes to eating, the village continues to practice many age-old notions that the base of which is this notions of purity and pollution. For instance, whenever there's a feast in the village, only pakka food is made. And I was told not long ago, about maybe 10 years ago, the village feast was cooked only by Brahmins, and the Thakurs sat with each other, that's the Rajput caste. The Brahmins sat with each other, and rarely did they sit with each other. That has changed. Many Dalit families now were also called to, volunteer in the making of the feast, so they can touch the dishes, they can carry food and water. And yet when I spoke to some of the older members in the village, or especially from Dalit families, they said they are hesitant to go for these communal feasts because it's still fresh in their mind that they were not allowed long back. And they prefer to have these communal feasts at home. They take their portion of the meal and then take it home. Or sometimes they have parallel feasts, which are very specific to the different caste-based groups. So every one of them have their own temples, and then in the temple, the parallel feast is organized. So, this is in a nutshell what happens. We all know that public spaces offer as some element of, let's say, anonymity in a bigger city, but even in rural areas, there is the public way of doing. It allows us to drop some of these traditional identity that we wear and then mingle with the public, so to say. The nearest market there in this area is about a kilometer, maybe a couple of kilometers away. And at least on the face of it, it seems like everybody intermingles. But I found out that no edible which are served are to be served by anybody other than Brahmins. So in all the eateries, which there are plenty of, all the eateries are run only by Brahmins or the upper caste. And not long ago, if you were to have tea, and if you're identifiably lower caste, then you have to wash your own dishes. And very often you stood outside to drink your tea. So, well, in a nutshell, again, I do find that these practices seem to continue, excepting I noticed that whenever there are birthday parties, people seem to be serving a certain kind of food. And that food is always packaged, market bought. Very rarely now they seem to cook anything at home. And birthday parties seems to be one of the favorite ways to celebrate or even show your class aspirations. So, there's a whole kit that comes for these birthday parties, including balloons and, your decorative pieces, candles, and so on and so forth. And you can buy the whole stuff in a cake shop. So recently in the little market near the village, there was a cake shop and everybody was really excited because now we don't have to go to the nearest town to get the cake. So the cake is eaten by everyone across, and doesn't matter if the birthday party happens to be in a Dalit household. Everyone is invited. Some of the older people do not typically go to birthday parties, but parents and children are invited. And birthday parties are one of the biggest events happening in the rural areas, I noticed. And everyone seems to, want to celebrate a birthday party. So cakes are one, and biscuits are the other ones which are served anytime a guest comes. And rarely do the upper caste refuse a biscuit and namkeen. I think the obvious reason could be that it sits very well with the notion of purity and pollution, where, it's deep fried. But also I believe that it has to do with the fact that the maker of these products is barely known, or even if they are known, it somehow they seem to transcend caste or even Indianness. So they are in some sense neutral foods that have somehow surpassed caste notions. And there are many such neutral foods. Biscuits and cakes are one among them, but also patties, cream rolls, all kinds of things which come out of bakeries. For some reason, bakeries seem to have this value to it as somehow non-polluting. And that's also to do with the fact that when you talk about pakka food, it must have not only ghee, if possible, but anything that is dairy has a very exalted state. I remember once visiting my neighbor with a friend who was from Italy, and she was frantically looking to serve something for us, which is befitting, you know, of a guest. She couldn't, and she wanted to give us some tea, but instead she felt maybe we would refuse it. So she gave us some fresh cream, malai as we call it, you know, it's the film on the milk, because again, it's considered pure. So the fact that the dairy products have sugar and I mean, the bakery products have sugar and dairy in it seems to somehow give them this neutral position. So the point that I want to make basically is that because we don't see very obvious signs of distancing based on these notions of purity and pollution in urban areas, we seem to forget that these notions still seem to exist. And they have a way of coming up in different contexts. I think one example I can offhand think of is when the controversies surrounding the midday meal scheme, one of which was the fact that many of the midday meal schemes, at least the policy encouraged women to be employed for cooking, and that to marginalize women. So there was a lot of discontent around that fact that the women who were cooking were not from upper caste. There have been many instances where children refused to eat, or the parents came and took away the children, and so on and so forth. And around this time, the government was seriously contemplating on introducing packaged food, fortified, however, to meet the dietary requirements, which was one of the reasons why midday meal scheme was started in the first place. And the biscuit companies were the first one to pitch in a massive campaign, Parle Biscuits, and it was debated quite vehemently by then UPA government that biscuits would be ideal. And subsequently, yeah, I think I'm running out of time. Yeah, just to sum up, as I was saying, these notions keep coming up. Midday meal scheme is one of it. And the fact that, your various marketing agencies consult anthropologists to understand what are the notions that underlie food practices and consumption is another reason why we must relook at the idea of purity and pollution. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic, and so much more to say. Maybe we can get to in the comments and questions. So moving forward in the program now, we have Simiran Lalvani. And apologies, Simiran, for introducing you 20 minutes early. I hope it wasn't too much of a shock. So we have Simiran's paper, How Platforms Cook For and Cook Up the World. So please, Simiran, take it away.
Thanks, Luke. I'm also going to quickly share my screen. Right. I'm assuming I can be seen and heard, and my slide is in a full screen mode. So I'm just going to go on. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Simran, and my presentation today is part of my ongoing PhD research on the relationship between digital platforms like Uber Eats, Swiggy, Zomato, and food work, or the labors and cultures of food. In the next 5 minutes, I'll first summarize my project and the 2,000-word draft that I submitted. Then I'll spend a bulk of my time walking you through some of my findings. Breezing through the next slide, you get a bit more of a sense of my PhD project. I'm asking, how do people use platforms like Swiggy and Zomato and social media platforms like Twitter in answering what to eat next in the everyday? Framed in this way, I examine what platforms do to the relationship between care, consumption, and convenience. That sounds massive, but I want to narrow it down through the arrangement of meals. In the first year of fieldwork, I conducted a digital ethnography to examine how Swiggy and Zomato built relationships with users on the interface of their apps and on their use of social media platforms like Twitter. My in-person fieldwork was with consumer users in their homes and in a co-working space because consumers are also workers at other moments in time, and with the restaurant industry through interviews and attending industry events. The next slide maps my scholarly audience and gives you a glimpse of where all of this is located in my thesis. I engage with 2 large buckets of scholarship that have overlaps, but for simplicity's sake, one is the scholarship on the technology stuff, which includes these very different approaches on gig and social media platforms, digital labor, digital food colors, so on. The text that you read for the workshop is located in the second bucket of literature. That's diverse social science literature on flows between the home and the market. And I'm narrowing that down through flows about food, care, consumption. Through the next slide, I'll rapidly remind what I attempted to do with the draft, which was a sort of literature review. In the draft, I framed assetization of interfaces as a moment in the marketization, mediation, and massification of convenience. Assetization is simply a process of turning a thing into an asset. And the thing in question here is the interface or a screen that you tap on to order food. Flows between the home and the market were not invented by platforms. So I engaged with 2 scholarly traditions that study these flows. First, I located platformization in existing social science scholarship on marketization of food work. From this, in the subsection with italics, I made room for me to think of how I contribute to this already existing work. There I started to build on the understanding that cooking is mediatory work. When we think of it in both literal and metaphorical terms. In this literature, housewives are identified as the figure between the home and the market. So to that, I suggest that platforms add users as a social group to the front lines between the home and the market, as well as between businesses and the market. Mediation fresh in mind, I turn to media and culture studies literature on mediation as a form of marketization that other platform scholars have engaged with too. There too, in the italic subsection, I started to think of what I was doing with this knowledge. By taking cooking as mediatory, that idea further, I suggested that perhaps interfaces enable us to see how platforms using their interfaces as assets have massified convenience for users. This massification has implications on actual cooking work, which is cooking for someone else, and mediating flows between the home and the market or cooking up. In turning to media quickly, I missed the floating box that you see here, which signals a third audience that I'm actually interested in engaging with. Very much related to the marketization of food work is the literature on what work does to how we do care and consumption. In other words, marketization via the workplace. Since I met consumers at home and at work, this is an important set of literature for me. Now that you have all of this information, in the next 10 minutes, starting with the next slide, I will share select findings from which I have arrived at this argument about the assetization of interfaces. The screenshot of the Zomato homepage on here shows how interfaces personalized listings. So for instance, order again is based on my ordering history as a consumer user. They have other sections on the app that personalize in different ways. For instance, you see the section below order again, which says in the spotlight. So the platform, Zomato in this case, has curated certain restaurants and put them in the spotlight. In other spots on the app, you see that there are banners that are sold as spaces of advertisement. By being with two types of users, consumers and businesses, and drawing on my own experiences as a user, I suggest that interfaces like the one on the left are sites where consumers looking to order food and businesses looking to sell food are increasingly getting curious about how platforms are curating encounters between people. Of course, algorithmic systems are black boxes, so we cannot be certain about how they curate these encounters, but all of my informants had theories, and these theories revealed norms of circulating on platforms. So on the next slide, I explain why users share this investigative spirit. The image on this slide is an excerpt of one consumer user's investigation of Swiggy, which is a food delivery platform. The user was trying to find and avoid restaurants that they did not like on Swiggy and Zomato. And in this quest, they noticed that the same FSSAI license number was being used across multiple listings. This simply meant that one cloud kitchen, which was operating from one location in Bangalore, appeared 189 times with similar names like Kebab Junction, Biryani Mehfil, Khan Sahab. This shows that restaurant users tried different things to be visible to consumer users on the interface. Whereas consumer users were bothered by this because they wanted to avoid food that they didn't like. And they were spending money on ordering food. Due to this user culture that hinges on visibility or being found and finding, I suggest that interfaces become crowded, as you can see on the screen. This incident is also useful in bringing attention to cloud kitchens or food businesses that do delivery-only types of cooking. It's because of assetized interfaces as sites that cloud kitchens can grow the way that they do now. Outside of the interface, cloud kitchens have lowered the barrier for entry into the restaurant industry since they reduce the cost of rent, they reduce the need to get as many licenses, the cost of labor. So initially, the restaurant industry pushed back and accused platforms of furthering informality. Yet, in a chapter in my thesis, I trace an evolution between the industry and platforms, which despite a brokering of peace between the two, the restaurant industry is still smarting from the fact that there's a falling average order value because cloud kitchens can sell food for greatly reduced prices, and their long-standing complaint about commission fees still holds. Commission fees are the fees that restaurants or food businesses pay to the platform for being listed on their interface. Given this reduced price and ability to scale geographically, I argue that cloud kitchens can be helpful in understanding the way platforms contribute to an ongoing massification of convenience. In the next two slides, crowded interface will loom in the background visually, and my findings as I wind up my presentation about what does the massification of convenience mean for consumers and restaurants? Specifically, how do people and industry respond to encountering crowded interfaces? Does being crowded threaten interfaces as assets? Now, opening Swiggy and Zomato to decide what to eat next was a daunting task for most people. Whether people planned what they wanted to eat before they opened the app, or they opened the app and then explored curations to make a decision about what to eat, there was an agreement that listings can be quite overwhelming. There were too many options. The only exception to this was if you lived in a distant suburb like Thane in Mumbai, which was not cool enough to have the good restaurants in a deliverable distance from you. This potential of being overwhelmed would cost my informants time and be experienced as frustrating. So most people turn to the reviews and ratings section to filter the crowd of restaurants on the interface. Yet the popularity of reviews, the fact that food bloggers had opened up the work of reviewing to just about anyone, meant that they were also suspect. Additionally, the possibility of reviewers getting paid or getting food for reviews invited suspicion around, could this be a genuine review? Outside of the interface, crowded interfaces sat alongside an ongoing massification of convenience, and together they invited an anticipatory harm minimization in the kitchen. Many users had switched to clay, brass vessels, and avoided aluminum. By controlling the materials of vessels, it seemed that consumers were responding to the risk posed by inexpensive food that emerged from outside the home, but as well as food that was cooked at home, because they were suspicious of the vegetables and the produce that they were buying and how it interacted with vessels. Several consumers explained that they had learned about paying attention to these things from social media platforms like Instagram and YouTube channels, especially a popular Sattvic movement channel, which showed up on their explore pages. The next slide leads us to how restaurant businesses and the industry responded to crowded interfaces. We know from the cloud kitchen with the 189 listings on Swiggy that where you appeared on the interface mattered. If you were ranking higher up, it would be easier for you to be found. But in addition to where restaurants appeared, how they appeared via reviews and ratings mattered too, since people were referring to these thinking, is it worth ordering from here? Which dishes were good? Is the delivery fast? Outside of the interface too, in the space of cloud kitchens, I suggest that practices of commercial cooking had to respond to interfaces too. You can see that with this image on the left of a pamphlet for 2 smart machines being sold at the cloud kitchen convention that I attended. These machines show us how cloud kitchens as a model compelled commercial cooking to be more convenient, or cooking now had to maximize time, space, labor who had minimal training, as well as cooking now had to leave a trail of data. See how the e-pan only requires reheating frozen parathas. It allows the person cooking to be someone who doesn't know how to make a paratha from scratch. The Dosamatic automates dosa making to ensure standardization, customization with the pressing of buttons. These machines are attributed with intelligence because it is assumed that compared to human labor, machines are more fail-proof, and because they generate a trail of data. How much inventory is used, left, which operator was using the machine when a dosa that invited a bad review was cooked. After having briskly walked you through bits of what I found, I want to pause for a breath in this next slide. This sums up what I've tried to do in the last few minutes. The select findings I shared have led me to suggest 2 things. 1, cooking is mediatory work that currently occurs via interfaces as sites of platforms curating encounters between people and businesses. By thinking of cooking as mediatory work that occurs on interfaces, I tack platformization as a moment in a longer history of marketization, mediation of flows between the home and the market. Secondly, I argue that platforms use these interfaces as assets by setting norms of circulation, as they were literally cooking for the world by enabling cloud kitchens. Norms on interfaces had implications for consumers, businesses, and industries' lives outside of the interfaces too. Yet cooking for the world, or assetization, that set norms didn't determine how the world was cooked up. I showed this by studying the user cultures and their everyday lives that revealed that in cooking for the world, interfaces got crowded. This meant a barrage of options which people and industry had to navigate. And this was experienced as challenging and created challenges for platforms as people navigated their systems. On the final slide, I just want to say thank you and introduce you to some of my prior work, which also informs my approach to tech mediation, if it piques your interest. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Simiran. Wonderful stuff. And finally, we move over to Dr. Thomas Herzmark with a paper entitled Meat, Maize and Cheap White Rice, Mealtimes as Indexes of Generational Transformation in Adivasi, Andhra Pradesh. Thomas, please on your camera, on your mic, and take it away.
Thanks, Luke. I trust you can all hear me and see me. And thanks, James and Nilanjan and my co-panelists and everyone. It's good to be here. Many of our papers begin with some kind of assertion of the importance of food to identity in South Asia. And mine also does as well, in that I highlight the ubiquitous manner in which asking if someone has eaten is, in my field site, the most basic expression of concern for another person. Many of our outlines have emphasized this connection in broad social and political terms as defining and cultivating class and caste communities, and also delineating individual sensibilities and identities. So my contribution began as a chapter of my PhD thesis, which I'm developing through this workshop. And in that context, the focus on food for me started with close observation of social relationships. Following the production and consumption of foodstuffs and the exchanges of giving, taking, serving, and eating enabled me to empirically tap into much wider questions of provisioning, gendered labor, economic change, and I suppose social reproduction in a broad sense in the Adivasi community in which I worked. It's a fascinating contrast with the previous paper from Simiran and the others in this panel, but there are interesting similarities as well. But my field site is a small rural village, which I call Illuru, a pseudonym, which is home to just 14 households. So it's quite an isolated and sparsely populated place. And it's a place inhabited by Krea Adivasi people in the northern belt of Andhra Pradesh. So in Illuru, in this village, a huge proportion of everyday work is devoted to ensure that people are fed through cultivating, through gaining access to state resources like publicly distributed, subsidized white rice, through hunting and collecting fruits, tubers, roots, and leafy vegetables from nearby forests, and through taking quite long trips of 35 kilometers by foot initially in the earlier generation, and by auto rickshaw to market. Attention to food and to diet in this setting really implicates a critical historical materialist perspective, but I also emphasize food as a focal point for everyday interaction. And as I say in the title, as an index for wider generational transitions in tastes, in expectations, and in people's aspirations. To outline the foundational thinking behind the argument of my paper, I would suggest that the associations and affinities that people have to particular foods represent people's ideas of what sort of people they are, or what sort of people they see themselves as being or becoming. And in that way, I think, like a few other papers in the workshop, I'm implicitly invoking a slightly Foucauldian notion of self-cultivation, while also grounding what I say in a broad historical understanding of how economic policies in post-independence India and liberalization creates the conditions in which people consume and relate to food. I'm also interested in thinking about the challenges of ethnography as a method for establishing broader arguments in terms of food and food studies, especially paired back to a very short presentation. I face an issue of kind of sample size and the representativeness of my work, so I welcome any comments on that. Taking a ground-up ethnographic perspective on food choices and diet in Adivasi, Andhra Pradesh, I note, as I said, that people consume foods from 4 spheres of production. There are foods that are harvested from nearby forests, foods that are produced in shifting cultivation plots around their villages. In the Krea Adivasi community, traditionally, this cultivation is done once a year. It's rain-fed, very low, very high labor intensity, and with no labor-saving technologies, where the forest is cut down and burnt, and a mixed crop cultivation is done by hand in small family units. Third, we have foods that are purchased from the market. And fourth, there are foods that are brought at highly subsidized rates from state distribution depots, such as rice, sugar, and kerosene. Against this backdrop of different arenas of food production, my paper takes the family mealtime as a frame to explore generational differences in taste and identity. Mealtimes, the practice of actually eating together, can often make explicit certain hierarchies and reveal interpersonal preferences and practices. There's a lot to discuss about the order in which people are served, the way that degrees of closeness are reflected in how meals are structured. And I'm always ready to take up the important global question of who washes up after whom. But in this narrowed down version, I'm orientating the paper towards post-independence changes, towards identity, more than questions of relatedness. So I'm focusing on the meanings attached to the consumption of three key types of food: white rice, maize, and hunted meat. Analyzing the syncretic diet of my Adivasi interlocutors and thinking through their food choices historically reveals important variations and continuities in their livelihoods, as well as in their relations to the state and their positionality vis-a-vis each other, and broader cultural schemas that motivate their food choices. Looking at this, their mixed diet actually reveals a deep interdependence between the different spheres of production that I mentioned: the state, the forest, and the market, and the shifting cultivation plot. Contrasting generations have very different expectations of provisioning, which are reflected in the ethnography I'll share now, and which reflect relative degrees of integration into regionally dominant ideas of family well-being. So I want to argue that locally hunted meat and government subsidized white rice make up today the traditional meal in the area that I work in. Despite their origin in very different modes of production and their association with radically different forms of sovereignty and citizenship, both these food types are really prized in this community. Hunting is valuable because of the dense protein it provides, and because it locates those who consume it in kinship systems and within local patterns of sociality. Hunting establishes bonds of cooperation. It ensures large families can be fed, and it is implicitly redistributive as the produce is shared between all the participants on a hunt. White rice, on the other hand, can also ensure that large families can be fed. It can be reliably stored, easily cooked, and it represents the state's obligation to provide for people, therefore bolstering people's awareness of their entitlement to certain types of support. This counterintuitive pairing is representative of the syncretic and pragmatic mode of social reproduction prevalent across the Koya-speaking region today. So I'll now turn to some ethnography of a mealtime interaction before discussing how this consumption indexes larger regional and national processes of change and transformation. In Iluru village, mealtimes are often the only time that Pochama, a widow and a female head of her family, speaks for more than a few seconds with her two sons, Praveen and Lokesh. A typical meal in their home is white rice with locally hunted meat, dried over a fire, and then stewed with onions, chilies, turmeric, and tamarind water. Common accompaniments to rice are curried dondakai, tiny gourds which sprout from the tangles of vines that run along bamboo thatched fences in the village. Other types of gourd and pumpkins are also grown on the shifting cultivation plots. The rice, which is a large grain variety called vegiokati, or 1,000-to-1, is collected monthly from a government depot, where all the Iluru families are entitled to a quota of 5 kilograms per person per month at the heavily subsidized rate of 1 rupee per kilo. In the summer and in the monsoon, when gourds are out of season, Pochama's family buy vegetables from market. They spend the money that they generate through the sale of cashew nuts and palm wine on vegetables like aubergines and okra. This is seen as quite an extravagance by relatives who have not maximized their yields from cash crops. For most families, the market is a source for onions, chilies, turmeric, and salt, and cooking oil. These long-lasting items are used to make saru, a tamarind broth, which is pretty much the simplest accompaniment to rice when homegrown lentils and vegetables are finished and meat is not caught. Earlier generations in this village survived through the rainy season without subsidized rice, eating the locally cultivated maize as their staple, and by drying, roasting, and then grinding mango and jackfruit seeds in the summer before rehydrating this powder to produce a porridge which is called java. This is associated with earlier times of hunger and scarcity. Pochama and her sons, after the meal, deliberate on which member of their family should do the errand of collecting the subsidized rice from the state distributions depot 6 kilometers away. Although every family in Iluru do produce their own maize or amudora on their hill slopes, every family also has adopted the government subsidized rice as their staple, since it's cheap, sweet in taste, easier to prepare, and, as people tell me, very filling. Numerous Koya and Kondaredi people assert that their home cultivated grains are much more nutritious, but in this village, people always strongly preferred the sweeter subsidized white rice. So during our discussion over the dwindling supply of white rice, I asked why people don't eat more of the traditional maize. This suggestion was found hilarious by the two sons. They explained that it requires far too much work to dehusk, to clean, and to cook. And I probed further to confirm that this was precisely the work that everyone did before the white rice was cheaply available. Through this conversation, it was decided that the amudora, the maize, would be prepared that evening, and that would mean the remaining white rice could be eked out a little longer. So that evening, their mother, Pochama, served herself and I the dense, fibrous, creamy brown grains of maize, which I thought were very tasty and produced a kind of comforting bloatedness. But the boys wouldn't eat this at all, her two sons. And anticipating this, Pochama had also prepared a pot of plain white rice. This distinction reveals the contradictory ways in which the grains are viewed by the different generations in this family. The produce of the family's own cultivation is held in low esteem by the younger men, even though they have actually worked to cultivate those grains, whereas the female head of the household was keen to cook and eat her homegrown maize. Further interviews with the two young men revealed that they see this grain, amudora, as less digestible, less tasty, and they associate it with an earlier period in their family's history, and with food shortages. When the young men tell me today how much they enjoy the taste and satiation of 2 full plates of white rice, they put themselves into a homogenized tastscape of contemporary Telugu culture. Their dislike of maize, however, does not extend to all the traditional foodstuffs from around the village, and certainly not to meat. I'm sure, as it's already been elaborated as well in this panel, that many of you are familiar with some of what I'll say now, but in popular upper caste South Asian understandings, vegetarianism is linked to purity and meat eating linked to pollution. While this religious and cultural food symbolism does filter into local lower caste discourse in Andhra Pradesh, this region is also, as we know from James's work, a really important counter-hegemonic region where, especially for Dalit communities, beef is a traditional food and meat is widely eaten, served at weddings. It's also become politicized to certain cultural events. And for Koyas, eating is not in any way part of their eating beef or eating meat is not integral to any public identity making, but it is enjoyed at weddings and funerals. Hunted meat also has further internal and external signification. Within the village, it's the result of working together to provide for people. And beyond the village, it references a traditional social life and hospitality, although this is potentially stigmatizing in the eyes of other caste communities. In Ilura village, meat is sourced by hunting in small groups of male kin. Adult men train their sons and nephews to provide meat for their extended families. And on some instances, the boys, Praveen and Lokesh, are very reluctant to go with their uncles, but their mother will chastise them and encourage them and say, if you don't go, who will go? Because if you don't participate in those hunts, the family won't be given a portion of that meat. Older men who are passing this knowledge and experience on to younger men have no obligation to share their meat with neighbors who don't send a member of their household along to help. And interestingly, the practice of having somebody go along to support the hunt is also reflected in the way that every family will send one member away to collect the rice together. So there's almost a parallel pattern in the way that these two food types are sourced. Meat is divided into equal shares and carried back to each household in a bundle of leaves or a metal pot, and often redistributed further to other relatives in other villages who don't have access to the same forest resources that Iluru people do. In this context, meat eating is implicitly a form of intra-household redistribution. In contrast, the subsidized rice is the result of national policies of redistribution, national policy of poverty alleviation. In the longer version of this paper, I explore the ways that family hunts are exemplary of Scott's suggestion that the primary network of provision are the closest kin who participate together in regular subsistence hunting. And as those networks get larger and larger, the responsibility of people to provide for those in need is diminished. For some families, this network extends outwards in concentric circles of relatedness. For other families, it's made up of closely neighboring relatives. A large animal like an adult deer can provide meat for many months, which is a hugely valuable resource in a world of potential scarcity, where the memory of times of hunger are very close to people's understandings of the present. So the four key sources of food production in this village, shifting cultivation, forest hunting and foraging, state distribution, and the market, represent distinct histories and practices for providing for others, which are actually very interwoven in their everyday lives. Somewhat counterintuitively, it's precisely through the state's constitutionally enshrined protections on land that locally redistributive modes of food production, like hunting and shifting cultivation, are enabled to continue. The autonomy to hunt is enabled through the constitutional provisions for Adivasis, although hunting itself is not legal. Retained in recent memory are experiences of scarcity and hunger, even amongst the youngest generation. So the subsidized provision of white rice is a much more reliable food source for shifting cultivators today than their own traditional staple. And as I noted, the gathering of subsidized grain from the state is done collaboratively, with each household sending one member to the depot. In this way, access to state resources resembles the redistributive practicalities of collecting edible forest produce or hunting. Hunted meat symbolizes the autonomy that Koyos here enjoy over ancestrally cultivated forest land, as well as local hospitality and desires to provide for relatives who have grown up without such privileges. Meat thus has a very high value, a status and nutritional wealth, and a cultural capital. Similarly, subsidized rice is crucial to Iluru villagers, not simply because of its nutritional content, but it's sought after because it symbolizes their inclusion in a cultural hierarchy of consumption, and it itself is a form of support from the state. Iluru's youngsters value the continuity of taking on their parents' livelihood practices, but at times appreciate these within a denigratory cultural model of themselves as distinctly ethnicized by their food consumption practices, especially in relation to more desirable regional tastes and consumption habits. By historicizing the food sources that sustain Iluru Koyas today, we see that the labels based on these villages' mode of production or identity as shifting cultivators, as Adivasis, as peasants, as James Scott might term them, or as hunter-gatherers, fail to render the overlaps between these different livelihoods. Today's food choices show wide fluctuation in the sources of nutrition available, as the state's provision and the changing natural resources are absorbed into local ideas of well-being. In the context of recent experiences of hunger and scarcity, the post-colonial state shows a caring side, offering forms of redistribution through rice subsidy and through the protection of autonomous provisioning, safeguarding the forest rights to cultivate the land, even while other aspects of the state law contradict these mechanisms for sufficiency. Thank you.
Wonderful stuff, Tom. Thank you very much. What a great set of papers. I'm going to provide a few comments and thoughts and questions on them, and then we're going to go over to the panel. But also, can I just remind everybody who's watching on YouTube to please put your questions into the YouTube chat box, and we'll round those up in the end as well. Sorry. So I'm going to start. I'm going to start with Simiran's paper, actually. And so the central motif of this paper is the notion of cooking up and cooking for. And the former refers to reshaping food worlds and relationships to food with a focus on flows and mediations between the home and the market. And the latter, if I've understood, is cooking for, which refers to how skimming through food apps is perhaps a new form of cooking itself. So Simiran states that ordering food by tapping buttons on an interface means that users as a social group join housewives on the front lines between the home and the market. But is there not a world of difference between individualized convenience consumption and the kind of symbolic and gendered work of household provisioning? Harry Solomon's work notwithstanding, one of the most clear ethnographic accounts of this is perhaps Janet Carson's chapter in the edited volume Money and the Morality of Exchange on cooking money in Malaysia. And here Carson shows the way in which money brought into the house from the market is detoxified through the cooking of food, thus exposing the moral and symbolic work of food, money and food money and gendered roles, and how they all interact from the market to the home and back again. Similarly, in Thomas's work, as we've just heard, it shows that the sort of primary mode of provisioning of the provisioning network is close kin. So I'm intrigued here on how we might creatively compare the screen scroll to, say, the hunt. Does the destabilizing of domestic order play into the suspicions that people have of cooking through apps, whether the apps are cooking for them or cooking up new forms of sociality? Or does the suspicion lie elsewhere? Interestingly, in the paper, discernment about food here seems not so much about class-based associations with certain food and how it's eaten. I shan't have my steak well done, thank you very much, and no, and noiseless tea stirring, please. The kind of thing discussed by Suchi, but rather about trust in its provenance. In Simiran's fascinating paper, The Cloud Kitchens obfuscates the provenance. Where have these bhajis come from? What kind of person has brought them to my door, perhaps? Thinking about Swagajoti Gohain's work here on new fancy roadside dhabas as exclusive dining spaces comes to mind. Do the dining worlds of the apps cook up worlds that are anonymous and solo? Do these allow for judgment-free experimentation with food? As Suchi's work has shown us in her paper, the pursuit of correct dining and the necessary grooming to achieve it clearly presents a booming market. And these concerns similarly speak to the work of circumventing food prescriptions illustrated through Kiran's paper. The contribution shows very well.
Just ask all of the panelists to put their cameras on, just because we're switching to gallery mode on the thing. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, very good, very good. Yes, please do.
And others when they ask a question, when it comes to that, to have their cameras on for that too. Apologies.
No worries. So in Kiran's paper, the contribution shows very well how the concerns for sanctity of food, who's involved in it, and at what stage do they come into contact. Here, seemingly old and village-based concerns seep very easily into urban locales and inform new consumerist culinary practices like biscuit packages, and so too the urban to the rural. But these practices are entrenched in casteism. And I'd be interested to hear from Professor Bhushi a little more about how the corporate opportunism that sits behind circumventing caste in marketing new culinary practices. And I wonder whether the app-based frontier is a useful space to continue this inquiry. Production and provision is at the heart of Thomas's paper exploring the family meal through syncretic forms of social reproduction. And this is about how food indexes a larger social transformation. And it's here also that the state, otherwise somewhat absent from this set of papers, creeps into the conversation, almost in tune with the central tenets of liberalization. And I'm very sympathetic to the issues of drawing arguments from the dinner table of a particular family. And I wondered, Thomas, how you counter the critique of particularity when talking about rice and grain preference. But also, how does something like hunting offer perhaps an anti-modern stance or resistance even, especially when thinking about the types of transformations taking place elsewhere in urban centres? And we stay at the dining table for Suchi's fascinating paper, which may also be seen as linked to Professor Bhushi's through the theme of exposure. So for Kiran, it's about diners being exposed to certain producers. But in the case of Suchi's course attendees, it's about diners exposing their ignorance about the world to other imagined middle-class diners. And at the heart of each paper is a complex risk to social status. The subject matter here is gripping and made incredibly relatable through the ethnographic documentation, but it did leave me wanting to know much more about Delhi as a specific location for this kind of cultural consumption, the colonial connections, and a more fine-grained analysis of the participants themselves. Because for some in Delhi, this kind of activity would, of course, appear perhaps rather passé, if not indicative of class qualities that are not so positively admired. The overly enthusiastic class ascender, not to put too blunt a point on it, the notion that you're learning something later in life that, if you truly were the right sort, would have been ingrained in you as a child. So just a few connections and points to share across the papers there. And I'll hand over for other questions also, or if anybody would like to respond to some of the things raised. And thank you very much for an amazing set of papers. Should we take a few specific questions if anybody has a question for one of the presenters directly? Am I audible?
You are. I put my hand up. I don't know if you can see it. I have some questions if you want to take these now from the live stream. Do you want me to do those now, or would you rather wait? Get some from the floor first. Okay, we'll go first with those. So I think I've got them kind of in the order. I've reordered them so that they relate to the order of the speakers. So first we have one for Suchi from Pat Kaplan, who asked, is the food that you're talking about divided into veg and non-veg, or is it supposed that in eating globally, one is necessarily non-veg? And I guess that might also be applied actually to some of the other papers as well. We also had a question for Kiran from Shmuel Yerushalmi. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing his name. He particularly asked me to mention his name. And he wants to ask how Indian independence supported or developed the traditional food of Brahmins. So a big, wide sweeping question there, but perhaps you can say something in response to that. And he also has a question for Simiran. How do you think food supports the development of relations or relationships between different cultures and nations? And then we have a question from Amanda Lanzillo, who's one of our colleagues, a historian here at Brunel, again for Simiran, who says, could you speak a bit more about the impact of apps on the gendered expectations of middle-class women? Are apps shifting expectations of the role of women in the home or in the workplace? Or are they shifting expectations about the role of household help and middle-class / servant relationship? If there are any more, if any of you out there on YouTube have further questions, please put them there, and we'll, even if we can't get to them in the time that we've got available in this session, I'll make sure that the speakers get them afterwards. I won't ask mine for now as well, otherwise I think we will be in danger of running out of time, but that's where we are so far. Thank you, Luke. And yeah, thank you all for a great set of papers. I really enjoyed them.
James, who's the first question directed at there that you read out? Sorry.
The first question was for Shuchi, I think. It says for the first speaker. I'm assuming that Pat joined at the beginning, and that wasn't just the first paper that she heard.
Okay, Shuchi, do you want to dive in?
Yeah, hi. So thank you for all the questions and the comments. It was quite enriching because I've come to the topic of food quite tangentially from my fieldwork. And because as I was doing my fieldwork, I was looking more or less about bodily practices and how people, the various kinds of grooming classes that exist in the city and what they are doing, particularly with respect to, say, language, spoken English, or bodily practices through personality development classes. And then what I started noticing was in all these classes, food played an important role because there was something called dining etiquette, which, all these grooming classes decided to sort of, at least have 2 sessions on it. So the question on veg and non-veg, and yes, so the food, because there was a paucity of time, I did not sort of delineate that, but there was in the high tea workshop, it was very clearly divided as to the participants. We all had to sort of state our preferences, and food was brought in accordingly as to who was veg and non-veg. But interestingly, in a personality development class, which catered to mainly young people who were in their early 20s and who were there mainly to get a job and to prepare for interviews and to sit for placements. So they were learning interview skills and other kind of soft skills. The instructor was in a way very flexible, where she actually stated that she knows people have their food preferences and it's important to adhere to some of these questions of identity. But at the same time, because she was also teaching us attitudinal training and there was so much emphasis on flexibility, she also ended up urging the students to be flexible and to never say no to any new kind of food, but to at least once try. And it was left at that level of request because the idea of being like this globally familiar subject or somebody who's urbane/urban and who's aspiring to be global must be open in their preferences and should be open to trying out new experiences. And food was presented as an experience. For instance, in the hierarchy of grooming schools, it's the image consultants and the finishing schools who are actually the most expensive in terms of how much they charge. So like this tea drinking workshop was for 3 hours, it cost about $40. Like everybody had to pay for it. And in that, so for instance, at an image consultants where I went in as a client, the first session, before we began even a session on appearance management, we had this discussion on food, and there was an entire experience that was curated for me via food. So the different kinds of food that were brought in, and non-veg was, it was just assumed. And what I found surprising was this, that especially with the tea drinking workshop, many of the elderly women, because this was a age group where these were women in their 50s and who are mostly whose children were grown up or they were married. Some of them had come with their daughters-in-law for this afternoon soiree. The elderly women, some of them were they were very strict. They said that whenever they went abroad for their holidays, they insisted on vegetarian food. And in a way, everybody was thankful that Europe, especially which was their favorite holiday destination, was turning vegan. So it was, which meant that vegetarians in India had much more options compared to how it was before. But they did not have such dietary or gastronomical restrictions for their children. And the children were ambivalent, where if they were with their friends, and this is something that the parents also knew, that they would be eating non-veg. Of course, we did not discuss the topic of beef because it's North India and it's upper caste men and women. So somehow the question of non-veg again was restricted within acceptable forms of non-veg, which was mainly white meat. So chicken, fish, and sometimes mutton/lamb. The other thing is this, that Delhi, the existence of grooming schools, to answer Luke's question, the existence of grooming schools actually describes an inequality in capital. And in the sense that there are like a lot of people who have been to English medium schools, people who come from an upper caste/upper class household wouldn't even need to go into these classes to learn how to comport themselves. These dining etiquette and all of this is part of their habitus. And while I'm not saying that grooming schools inculcate a sort of cultural capital or habitus, because it's not something that you can learn in a short window of time, what they at least do, I mean, what grooming schools are showing is that there is an inequality in capital, and the new forms of work, especially in the corporate culture or in the service industry, people should at least be aware of certain things. So the grooming schools were trying to sort of generate this kind of awareness, and there were people, like there were young men and women who also came to sort of make themselves feel belong to certain new spaces. So it could even be like we had role plays in class where you had to speak English, imagining that you are in a barista. So how do you order your cup of coffee, or say how do you incorporate a certain word in your vocabulary, which were called high caliber words, or words which were to improve your lexical resources. And so food and the situation of dining was often used as a way to sort of get into a new form of belonging and a new form of behavior and comportment. So that's how it is. And of course, it's what is interesting to also note is people of a certain class, upper class and upper caste people, often people like, say, I would consider myself in that strata, who have been exposed to a sort of a cosmopolitan culture. Many of my peers were very surprised at the existence of such classes. But there were also a great number of people who knew the existence of personality development and soft skills, and youth who went into these classes to get trained before they went for an interview, or if they're up for a promotion, or if they knew that there was a social event or a retreat coming up in their office, they wanted to brush themselves up, or before they went abroad. So the motivations were multiple. And in that way, like what was also happening with Delhi as a city is this, that it's Delhi pre-liberalization was not like the most happening of places. It was actually Bombay, which was the most forward in that sense of being a cosmopolitan and a cosmopolitan city. But Delhi changed once it was the post-90s, and the Punjab, while there are these curated dhabas, there were also these pan-Asian and other kinds of cuisines that started coming in, which then also became a matter of status as to like, you need to be worldly wise or globally familiar. And that's where I sort of located dining practices as one way of admission, one way of accessing certain spaces. So thank you. And thank you very much for the questions. These are obviously like questions for more food for thought for me. So thank you very much.
There was an interesting connection there to a question that came up in the chat from Amanda Lanzillo about the impact of apps on gendered expectations of middle-class women, that perhaps Simiran, you could say something to.
Should I just respond to that one question, or should I also do the others quickly? What do you?
As you feel.
Okay. Because the first question on, and I'm really sorry about my screen glitching. I suppose the interface is shaping how I'm seen as well. So I'm sorry for the jarring visual. But the question on food and like development of relations is interesting, because I think a lot of the work has seen food as media, because it makes food as media. Makes connections between people. I think I'm interested in seeing what digital media does to those pre-existing forms of food connecting people, and so in that I've found how digital platforms have opened up the work of delivering food. Like Luke hinted earlier, it's now food delivery workers are also women. So it was a male-dominated line of work, and now that's opened up. So there's like an opening up at the level of delivery work, at the level of cooking, because cloud kitchens, kind of further anonymize who is cooking. Being able to order is also something that's been opened up because of digital technology. And I feel like that happens because, and this I think in part answers the question on the shifting relations between cooks and homes, because
Simiran,
with
sorry, can I just interrupt for a second? Sorry, having asked you to turn your camera on, would you mind if I asked you to turn it off? Yeah, that's better. Sorry, it's just because of the glitching. Sorry, and please carry on.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Oh,
Sorry.
thank you. This makes sense. So I suppose what was interesting was food delivery apps made the service of having a cook both more easy and less expensive. It was less expensive because you wouldn't have to pay a cook a monthly wage. You could just order one off. And it was easier because a lot of the people, all of my informants had cooks, and all of them complained that their cooks' cooking was not to the taste, to their household taste. So for instance, if they were Maharashtrian and if they were North Indian and the cook was Maharashtrian, they would put the bagar in the dal in a particular way that was not to their regional taste preference and so on. So people were often using apps to say supplement cooking that the cook was already kind of hired to do. And so like I'm using, this is to say that these were not substitutes, but at the same time, apps were opening up the work of having your cooking outsourced to more households than before. And then the question about gendered implications, and I think on middle class women, I think the use of apps had shifted and opened the work of planning meals in some ways. So for instance, it was common for other men in the household to order food, like plan the meal by ordering food on behalf of, but it was still on behalf of. So there were practices that were shifting, but in many ways, I suppose the expectation of meal planning was still something that women were expected to do. And I think it's also hard for me to say anything very solid about what were the gendered implications on households, because the households that I was in, it was a convenience sample. So they were very different. There were young couples, there were multi-generational families, there were house shares. So in those, like given that diversity in the sample, I think it's harder for me to say something about the gendered expectations. But I do think that the reason I'm also interested in thinking of users as a social group is that I feel like we think of individual consumption as being necessarily very distinct from gendered provisioning. I think also something that Luke was highlighting earlier. And I'm kind of interested in saying that even as individual consumers, the work of providing for self and for others shows how consumers carry, like the consumer is not a neutral market created category, but really is still a gendered class-based category. And so, I think I'm going to stop because I think I've made some little bit of a khichdi of all the questions and answered, but I will stop here. Thank you.
Perfect. It was very nicely done. There's an interesting question here as well on YouTube for Tom about how YouTube videos have impacted the way local people conceive their relationships with traditional food. Perhaps you could speak to that? And actually, I wonder if Kiran could maybe say something to that as well from her experiences. But Tom, should we start with you?
Thank you. I'm not sure which YouTube video the question is referring to, but I think in general there's a process of people in my quite remote field site becoming aware of the exoticization of certain types of food that they produce. some people know that the maize and millets that are grown, and certainly the palm wine, have become niche delicacies in other parts of, I suppose, urban and peri-urban Andhra Pradesh and further afield. There isn't much access to YouTube in the village that I do most of my field work. So I don't think people are consuming videos specifically that make them change their perspective on foods. But I think there's a wider process of Teluguization and cultural change, where people are consuming Telugu cinema and people are consuming different ideas about what constitutes a healthy meal. So they see higher caste and urban food settings on TV, and people desire that. People want to have small grained white rice and an assortment of vegetarian curries, because that becomes a positive association for them when they see wealthier and more, as they would say in my field side, economically forward communities consuming that kind of food. So it produces this, as I said, sort of self-deprecating idea about the traditional grains that they produce themselves.
Thanks, Krea and Jonty.
Yeah, should I take up some of the questions which came to me?
Please.
James earlier mentioned something that came up on YouTube. Was it whether the state, what was the question? Can I have the question if anybody? There was something about Brahmanism, whether the state actually encourages Brahmanical discourses of food, or was it Brahmanism?
Let me find it. Let me find that question.
In the meanwhile,
yeah.
I think Luke, thanks for tying up all the papers together. And I think I was a little disorganized with my paper presentation. I did want to talk about how the market seizes this opportunity, or actually is very cognizant of the edifice being, notions around purity and pollution. And actually, their marketing strategy revolves around this in some ways. At least that's been my experience. A few times I was asked to, respond or comment and give my feedback on cultural notions around many things by various marketing agencies. As an ethnographer. And so I do believe marketing strategists use this information, and that the edifice seems to be still in place. And if I recollect the question that James mentioned earlier, the state itself is part of this larger discourse of purity and pollution. I just very fleetingly mentioned the midday meal scheme, but if you look at the public distribution system, the ex-director of the National Institute of Nutrition, in fact, mentions in one of her interviews that in the 50s and the 60s, when the policies were being made to mitigate malnutrition, and public distribution was supposed to do one of the jobs of mitigating that. And there was a lot of debate as to what should be the staples that should be given to various people, marginalized sections mainly. And some people suggested eggs, and but it was shot down. And the ex-director says, and that's because most of the policymakers were Brahmins, So I think that continues to inform the public distribution system in India. And if you look at differences between states, Kerala, for instance, gives non-vegetarian food in their public distribution system too. In Tamil Nadu, it's there. And there is a direct correlation, some people argue, between the malnutrition or the health standards of the people of Tamil Nadu and Kerala versus the ones who are on a vegetarian diet. I'm not suggesting that vegetarian is bad or non-veg is, but there have been these studies. Well, that's as far as my response concerns with these two aspects that you highlighted and which James was mentioning.
Fantastic.
Thank you
so much. And incredibly, we are at 11:01 and prime for our tea break. Thomas had mentioned that he had a question for co-panelists over, but I wondered whether maybe we could, because we're going to be keeping this Zoom link for the next session, which is going to begin at 11:15, which is chaired by Devanshi and is putting hunger, aid and food shortages in context. So the YouTube link will remain the same and keep running. And this Zoom channel will remain open as well. So if people would like to presumably continue the conversation, they can, but we'll be starting and others can go and have a cup of tea, but no noisy stirring. And we can return at 11:15. And thank you very much for a wonderful panel. If I've missed anything on the housekeeping, James, please dive in.
I think that's all of it. I did have some more questions in the YouTube channel as well, which you can perhaps check out for yourselves. There are a couple there for Thomas. I also had lots of questions that I've jotted down, but I will save those and perhaps share them at another time with the speakers, because we've run out of time and we don't want to. I think our Zoom link also ends at lunchtime, and we go to the next Zoom link, so we don't want to run out of time at that end. Thanks, Luke, and thanks everybody for a really great set of papers.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much.
So welcome back everyone to the second panel of our workshop, which is titled Putting Hunger, Aid and Food Shortages in Context. So in this panel, I'm going to start again. So welcome back everyone to the second panel of our workshop, Putting Hunger, Aid and Food Shortages in Context. In this panel, we have 3 papers on the theme of food and identity from the lens of public nutrition, hunger and food security. These are all very significant and relevant for the subcontinent, as we know. And these intersect very much with the question of food cultures and public policy. So we have the papers in the following running order. So first we have Babar Hussain from the Institute of Social and Economic Change, Bangalore, with the paper Political Economy of Food Aid in Kashmir, a case of economic pacification and dependency. We then have Joanna Morrison from UCL and Kathmandu with the paper Eating for Honor, a cultural ecological analysis of food behaviors among adolescent girls in the southern plains of Nepal. And then we have a paper from Venkat Ramanujan of A-Tree, Bangalore, Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment. And he's presenting the paper From a Fistful of Millets to a Bagful of Rice, Anxiety and Aspiration in Adivasi Central India. And the 4th paper we're not really having on this panel today was by Carla. So we're going to have these 3 papers. And again, just to go over the main housekeeping rules again, we have 15 minutes to a paper because we do have a full program and we want to have time for discussions. And then also we must remember that as we have a speaker, the rest of us on the panel turn off our mics and cameras so that we kind of avoid the background disturbance to the extent we can. And also everyone on YouTube, do remember to put in your questions in the chat box so that we can pick them all together and take them up at the end of all the presentations. So with that, we shall hear from Babar Hussain on the paper Political Economy of Food Aid in Kashmir, a case of economic pacification and dependency. Over to you, Babar.
Hi, are you able to see my PPT and able to hear me?
Yes, Babar, you're audible and we can see the thing. Yes, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to present my paper on food aid in Kashmir. And it's part of my PhD work. And I have recently defended my thesis at Isaac, Bangalore. In this paper, I am trying to look at how land reforms shaped the food policy of Kashmir. And then I'm trying to look at how food aid impacted the self-sufficiency question in Kashmir. So the literature on Kashmir land reforms, it has underplayed the linkages between how land reforms are linked to self-sufficiency in food grains production as well as industrialization. And much of the papers on Kashmir land reforms, they talk about how land reforms have led to redistributive impacts in terms of like most of the people in Kashmir, they have access to land, like most of the people are having small land holdings in Kashmir. And that's why there is low poverty as well as inequality in Kashmir. And therefore, this paper asks why the radical land reforms, which happened in 1950s when Sheikh Abdullah was the prime minister of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, why they did not lead to food self-sufficiency in the region, and what implications does food aid play in terms of deepening the food dependency in the region. So my paper is mostly historical in nature. It's confined to the decades of 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It's more historical in nature. And I'm like there have been recently a lot of changes happening in terms of like there's too much dependency on food imports from Indian mainland, as well as there have been blockage issues. But I'm not going to focus much more on the contemporary period. I'm more focusing on the decades of 50s, 60s, and 70s. So before talking about land reforms and food aid in Kashmir, I will be spending some time on land reforms as well as food subsidy, food aid, and how that interacts with the local food production systems. On land reforms, White, Burras, and Hall, they have distinguished between 2 types of land reforms. One is conventional and another is broader. A conventional approach to land reforms is very limited in nature because it looks at land reforms only from the perspective of redistribution of land from landlords. And a broader definition of land reforms not only includes redistribution of land to the landless peasantry, but also at promoting sort of certain agrarian transition, whether that's capitalistic, modernistic, or modernized or smallholder. So the broader definition of land reforms is also about how land reforms should be used towards promoting self-sufficiency in food grains as well as promoting rural industrialization. And on land reforms, Christopher Krea has written a classic paper on synergy perspective in which he argues that states, once they implement land reforms, they should try to maximize intersectoral linkages between agriculture and industry. And in this type of synergy, state has to play an important role in terms of surplus creation as well as extraction and transfer from agriculture to industry. And on the literature which has come on the public distribution system in India, most of the literature focuses on how PDS is linked to the issues of food insecurity, accessibility, distribution. Like most of the works by Ritika Khare, Ahluwalia, they also talk in recent period, they have talked about how the new implementation of Food Security Act affects the accessibility as well as nutrition issues. However, there are exceptions. For example, the work by Mujh in Journal of Peasant Studies in 1998, it looks at the food policy of India from a political economy perspective, and he argues that the PDS in India is being strategically employed by the union as well as state governments in political and economic projects. He talks about the case of Karnataka and Kerala, where most of the leaders have used food subsidy as a sort of populist policies to impact the vote bank politics. And there are other works also, for example, by Pilakardi as well as Dam and Nusir. They found that in Ladakh region of Himalaya, subsidized food grains that are distributed by PDS, they discourage the farmers. So basically that discourages the local food production. On Northeast India, Rangaswamy notes that the food aid actually made the region dependent on government rations, and that could be stopped anywhere as a collective punishment because Northeast has a history of sort of resistance against the Indian state as well as ethnic tensions. However, most of the literature on public distribution system in India has not tried to look at how PDS impacts local agriculture development, especially in frontier regions of India, like in Northeast, Kashmir, or other Himalayan provinces. They also ignore the role played by unequal power relations. Before talking about land reforms in Kashmir as well as the food question in Kashmir, I'll give a brief background on the geographical and political context of Kashmir. As some of you might be knowing that the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir is a mountainous border state, which is strategically located. It's like a frontier zone situated in the extreme north of India. It consists of three regions, Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh. Whereas Ladakh is mostly Buddhist dominated, Kashmir is Muslim dominated, and Jammu is Hindu dominated. And the erstwhile state of J&K is also a fragile state because it has suffered from long periods of armed conflict, ethnic tensions, rigged elections, unemployment, widespread corruption, and human rights abuses. This is the map of the former state of Jammu and Kashmir. As you can see from this map, the state is divided into several. The princely state of J&K before 1947 has witnessed several changes because of the partition which took place in 1947. And both India and Pakistan have fought several wars, and they both claim this region. And it's right now divided between India and Pakistan, and both of them claim this region. And at the time of partition in 1947, there was accession of the former state of J&K with India, and it was promised at that time that in near future plebiscite will be conducted in the region, and which has until now that has not taken place. And at the time of its accession with India, J&K got widespread autonomy, ethnic autonomy through Article 370, which limited the control of Indian state to only 3 subjects: defense, communication, and foreign affairs. And in recently 2019, that autonomy has been abrogated, and now New Delhi directly controls the region. In 1947, when there was partition and J&K became part of India, Sheikhullah became the first prime minister, and he based his development ideology along the socialist lines, and that was based on the New Kashmir Manifesto of National Conference, which they came forward in 1947, and which basically stressed that there's a need for radical restructuring of the productive forces. Basically, they talked about abolition of landlordism in the region, because most of the land pre-1947, it was under the control of landlords, and the Muslim peasantry in the region, they did not have access to land. So several reforms were introduced by Sheikhullah during the post-1947 period. In 1948, he introduced Grow More Food scheme, under which a huge amount of cultivable wastelands, they were given to landless peasantry. In 1950, radical land reforms were introduced, and why they are called as radical? Because they were non-compensatory in nature. So the land that was taken from around 9,000 landlords that time, they were not paid compensation. And Sheikhullah, in his brief tenure as Prime Minister of the state, he stressed more about increasing the food self-sufficiency in region. And in that period, he even asked the people to eat potatoes, and and not depend on the food subsidy from other regions or food aid from the other. So there was a clear-cut focus on increasing the food self-sufficiency during that period. And he also introduced Mujwaza, a compulsory procurement of food grains, so that the food prices don't increase in the region, like farmers don't go for hoarding. And in spite of that, Sheikhullah has been criticized in that period, because orchards were kept out of land reforms, as well as he has been accused of sort of using authoritarian politics in terms of like suppressing peasantry to go for compulsory procurement of food grains. And there were other initiatives also. For example, he resisted the financial integration of J&K with the rest of India. He did not go for the 5-year plans of India. Like economically, the state was not part of India. To sustain this self-reliant model, the regime also preferred to broaden the tax base of the state. It remained adamant to continue custom barriers between J&K and the rest of India, and mostly custom barriers were introduced to protect the local industry, and he levied tax on education as well. If, in spite of the criticism of land reforms, there was still a substantial amount of land that was taken away from landlords, and it was given to landless peasantry, as can be seen from this table. And now trying to look at the impact of land reforms on the food production. As you can see from this table, in the initial stage of land reforms, there was a substantial improvement in terms of increasing the food self-sufficiency in the region. The food grains production increased, but with time, there has been stagnation in terms of, like, the food grains production did not witness a major breakthrough in the region. In spite of Green Revolution in the region in 1950s, there was like huge amount of investment in irrigation, but still it did not witness a major breakthrough in the agriculture. And most of the statist explanations are that because of land reforms, the size of land holdings decreased there, and that's why there has been a stagnation. But I critique those arguments in the later part of my presentation. And in 1953, there was a change in the regime, and Sheikhullah was arrested in 1953, and a new regime was imposed in the region, and Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad became the prime minister of the region. And Bakshi favored greater integration with the Indian Union. And during the post-1953 period, there was gradual erosion of Article 370, which gave a lot of autonomy to the region. And Bakshi also abolished custom barriers in the region, due to which there was free trade between J&K and the rest of the region. And Bakshi followed a policy of patronage politics to wean away people from Sheikhullah by liberally sanctioning permits, loans, licenses, forest leases, According to Rekha Chaudhary, the post-1953 period when Bakshi and others came into power, these regimes were so much burdened by the crisis of legitimacy that they totally became dependent on the support of center. So most of the energies of state leaders were spent more on surviving strategies. And in this period, when Sheikh Abdullah was in jail, the National Conference started the plebiscite front in the region, which was sort of arguing for right to self-determination of Kashmiri people. And if you look at the state intervention during the post-1953 period, in terms of investments in agriculture and other sectors, you can see that there has been a limited importance has been given to agriculture sector because very less investment went towards this sector, and most of the investment had gone to sectors like irrigation and power. However, according to Development Committee report of 1975, in spite of huge investment in irrigation and in other things such as high yielding varieties of seeds, still there was not a major breakthrough in the food grains production in the region. And during the post-1953 period, the region witnessed a change in the cropping pattern. And the discussion on the changes in the cropping pattern is important because according to Ali, who did a study in 1978, he found that there was a shift from low value food crops to high value cash crops. So a huge amount of land by the peasantry was transferred from paddy to horticulture. And it was because of several reasons. And one of them was that a section of powerful rural community in collusion with the new power elites, it managed to transfer paddy land to orchards. So basically horticulture, apple cultivation increased in the region. At the same time, the new regime abolished the compulsory procurement of food grains, and huge quantities of food grains were imported from other states. So basically, the ration was highly subsidized in the region, and the annual revenue expenditure in this regard increased from around 6.36 crore in 1965 to around 19.61 crores in 74. And most of this was possible because the central government gave a huge food subsidy in terms of food aid to the region. According to Puri, the ration was highly subsidized to the consumers to the extent of 75% of the cost. And economic mismanagement in that period can be understood from the fact that in 1963, the state was already surplus in cereals by 37,000 tons, and yet it imported around 88,000 tons in that year. And these food grains were sold in the state at highly subsidized rates through public distribution system. This shows that the state was importing more than what was required at that time. So basically, this was a sort of politically created scarcity in the region so that the peasantry shifts towards horticulture and sort of dependency gets generated in the region. And if you look at the post-1953 period, you can see from this table that huge quantities of food grains were imported from the rest of the region. And with time, this food aid create a sort of trap in the region, and still the region is not able to come out of trade of this trap, and this dependency has increased with time. At the same time, food also in the post-1953 period, it constituted an important part of the Kashmiri identity as well as resistance politics. As I have already told in my earlier slides that in pre-1953 period, food had already got politicized because Sheikh Abdullah had asked the people to eat potatoes, but not to depend on the food aid from any country or from the rest of mainland India. And food politics got more, it increased more in the post-1953 period. According to Junaid, rice in Kashmir sort of occurred association with collaboration as well as idleness as well as dependence on India. So because of the changes which happened in 1953, a new class emerges, which is known as a collaborator class, and rice got much more politicized in that period. I'm also trying to look at more like how rice got politicized in that period by going through life history interviews. Basically, the land reforms of 1950s, they failed to lead towards self-sufficiency in food grains, as well as creation of rural industrialization in Kashmir. And the central to this has been the use of food as a strategy to sort of pacify people and also to create dependency in the region. And horticulture cultivation was vigorously expanded in the Kashmir Valley since late 1950s by both central and state governments. And the whole politics of it was to create market dependency in the region in terms of connecting the regional agriculture with mainland India. And all of this needs to be understood in the historical context of Kashmir being a frontier zone that has witnessed popular self-determination movements. Thank you.
So thank you, Babar. We'll move on to our second speaker. And we have Joanna Morrison with Eating for Honor, a cultural ecological analysis of food behaviors among adolescent girls in the southern plains of Nepal.
Okay, thank you very much. I will just try to figure this out. Okay, that you should be able to see my slides, yeah?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Yeah, so I'm very honored to be here among anthropologists because I am an aspiring anthropologist, and I also kind of wrote that in my in my email to James. So I hope you'll be kind to this this social scientist, this applied social scientist, in my analysis of these data. So I do a lot of participatory action research with researchers, and I did this work with Neha and Machindra and a team of researchers who were looking to improve maternal health in pregnancy. So my research really comes from this kind of idea that adolescent nutrition has been quite ignored in the public health literature. So the Lancet series on adolescent nutrition in 2022 rightly found that researchers focused on single interventions to try and improve adolescent nutrition, as opposed to, so for example, like giving people iron folate acid supplementation to teenage girls. But it doesn't necessarily account for the wider structural determinants of undernutrition and poor nutrition. And so that's where my interest kind of lies, is to try and look at adolescent nutrition in a particular context, and look at show you basically how gender really affects adolescent nutrition. So we did our research in Dhanusha and Mahotari in the plains of Nepal. It's the border with India. It's religiously quite an important place. It has quite a buzzing urban centre, but we did this research in the rural areas around, which you can see a picture of there. The population there is disadvantaged. There's a high Hindu population, but also a Muslim population there. Lots of underweight women, lots of anemia, low literacy, and high child marriage in this area. There's also patrilineal kind of marriage practices are common, and that's kind of as much background as I need to give you at this stage, I think. So as I said, this is a secondary analysis of data that was collected before a very large project to try and improve low birth weight. And the intervention that was tested was food, cash transfers, or participatory learning and action to improve that. So, but I'm going to be reporting on the data that was collected before the intervention. And we didn't really want to focus on unmarried women as in our formative research. So we have we have a small amount of data, which I found was really interesting. And when I presented it at a conference in Nepal here, people were very interested because of the dearth of research that is done with adolescents. So we used a cultural ecological model, sorry, to analyze our data, which you can see the sort of framework of it there. So basically, it provides a theoretical structure to organize the determinants of nutrition. And it has 5 interrelated components. So the physical and social environment where food is acquired, social organization, so that's down in the left, where is about how households take care of their members and how food and eating is organized in the household. Lastly, technology, which is related to food production, distribution, and acquisition. So we didn't actually collect data in the technology component, so I have nothing to present there, but this framework was still useful for us. And then those components kind of interact with the biological and biophysiological characteristics of individuals. We collected data in 6 villages with girls and FCHV's female community health volunteers, and mothers-in-law. So in terms of the social organization of eating, so we could see from our data that there was, a real acknowledgement of boys' future role, their future earning role, and their earning capacity, and therefore the need to nourish them, the need to give them more food, better foods, and also give them freedom in their eating, so they could eat as they pleased. So I have a lot of quotes in my presentation because of the style of research that I do, and I think they're quite powerful. So I'll read some out as we go along. So my parents tell me, this is from my girl, you remain in the home, so you eat this thing only. He goes abroad, but where do you have to go? You don't have to go anywhere. You have to stay at home or go to your in-laws' house. So the other idea that came through was this idea of dutiful girls. So girls being able to understand the situation of their parents, not ask for money to eat outside the home, but really kind of be dutiful, do as they're told, live within the home and eat within the home. So daughters are very brave. They understand the condition of their parents more than their sons can. Daughters eat rice and lentils, so that kind of simple food, basically. They eat whatever they're given to eat. So also that kind of notion of no choice, no consideration of eating what you'd like to eat. So if we move over to the physical and social environment of eating, as I was saying before, girls are expected to eat at home, and boys can eat whatever they like, and they eat outside. And that really kind of reflects on norms around girls' mobility in this context, and how it's quite restricted. So we see that also reflected on the way that girls eat. So these girls told us boys move here and there and eat in different places, different foods at different places, but girls don't wander around. They don't even go outside the school. They just eat grams from the nearby tela in their lunchtime. So culture is, there was a lot of data under that sort of broad category of culture. We found that so there were notions that good food was necessary for physical development, which was positive for boys, particularly because families wanted them to grow strong and be able to earn and provide for the family. Whereas with daughters, there was a concern that they shouldn't develop too soon, because then their marriage has to be done. So girls were also expected to be restrained in their eating. People would talk badly about them if they ate too much, if they showed greed. So when they go to other people's houses, they should be mindful of that, and they should restrict their behaviors. Mostly they tell us to eat less is what these Hindu girls told us. So also we see sort of eating behaviors as a type of preparation for their life as a daughter-in-law in their husband's home, where they won't be able to eat this kind of luxury outside foods. And so it's kind of training them for expecting that kind of life, and they shouldn't get into the other habits, bad habits of eating outside. So we also find that the type of food you eat and what you eat indicates that your behavior and the kind of person that you are. Lots of people have talked about this already in the first session. So the first quote, there's a difference in the eating pattern of children in different families, where the guardian cares for their children. The children are good, they have good behavior, they eat properly. This is notion of eating properly, and they study well. Those children who don't follow their parents, they have bad manners, they eat whatever they like. So this real kind of eating behavior mixed in with your the type of person that you are. And we see that that sort of transfers onto those conceptions of mobility. So the bad foods are in the snack shops, and also those snack shops are not places where girls should be spending their time, and therefore, you know, they shouldn't be outside their homes wandering around without purpose, and they shouldn't be going to snack shops where there are lots of men. And girls who do that are seen as neglected by their families. And we really see that the sort of the gendered space of the snack shop is really being a male environment. And so people would talk badly about girls if they went there. So this is, you know, sort of the quote there from a health volunteer saying, people don't say good things about girls when they eat outside. They're not allowed to go to the crossroads to eat. People recognize them and consider it to be a bad habit. So just to not take up too much time, I thought I would just discuss sort of the conclusions and implications of this research. So maybe I haven't presented anything that is particularly new, and I think that there are definitely changes in the gender norms, but I think that this really brings home the fact we need to look at you know, eating in context and eating for different genders, because eating practices are really symbolic of this differential relationship in this particular part of Nepal, where you know, there's real differences between boys and girls. And their girls' restricted mobility practices, which have been, you know, written about a lot, that also extends to their eating practices. So we need to think about, you know, mobility as linked to eating, which I don't often see in the public health literature. So we need more research with boys. They weren't a part of our study, unfortunately, but I'd love to do more research with them, and girls and decision makers. And it really needs to be gender analysis of that data. We need a gender lens. To improve girls' nutrition, we do need to address the boy preference, and economic empowerment of women might do something for that. Obviously, it has lots of good health implications, but I think that you can clearly see the linkages between, you know, boys need to go and earn, and so they, whereas girls don't earn, and therefore, why should they eat well? We can see from our data that an individually focused sort of educative approach is not going to change things for girls. We need them to be supported by their families, community, and the state, and we need to challenge these norms to improve their nutrition. We also need to listen to adolescents. So, you know, in thinking about how we move forwards in reforming food systems and snacking, you know, we can see that snack shop eating might be aspirational, you know, and there might be more increased mobility of girls, which might lead them to eat in snack shops. So we should be careful as public health professionals not to put restrictions on girls who are exercising their newfound freedom, perhaps. So if we think about how to improve the nutrition of girls, it should be empowering and not restricting. So just to say a quick thanks to the study participants always. The study was funded by DFID, and the great photos were taken by Anuj and Amita Sharma. So I will end my presentation there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanna. That was really great. So we're going to move on to the last speaker on this panel, and that is Venkat Ramanujan from A3, Bangalore. And his presentation is titled From a Fistful of Millets to a Bagful of Rice, Anxiety and Aspiration in Adivasi Central India. So over to you, Venkat.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. It's been a great pleasure listening to the speakers early this morning, and also the two speakers who went before me in this panel. So let me first try to share my screen. And is my screen visible?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is, Venkat.
And could you tell me if the slides are moving?
Yes, they are.
Okay, thank you very much. If I'm going to be talking about a shift in cropping patterns and dietary change in Adivasi Central India, my name is Venkat Ramanujam. I'm a postdoc at a research institution called A3 in Bangalore. As many of us are familiar, Adivasis are a materially and discursively marginalized social group. They have among the poorest socio-economic indicators in India, and they're most likely to be displaced for development projects and national parks among all social groups. They're also officially categorized as a scheduled tribe, and the use of the word tribe has very distinct evolutionist and primitivist connotations, and it comes from this colonial era category that was instituted administratively and sociologically. And unfortunately, this category persists. And this leads to a primitivist, patronizing attitude towards Adivasis, an attitude that dominates media representations of Adivasi communities and which permeates state policy. I'm going to be specifically talking a little about forest villages because it is in a community of forest villages that this study is set. Now, forest villages are little known, but they were exemplars of this exploitation of Adivasi communities starting from the mid to late 19th century onwards. They were established as a source of cheap Adivasi labor for state-led timber extraction by the forest department, and they were set up inside forest area, deep inside forest areas, and therefore were remote, preventing interaction between Adivasis and other communities, which often lived, away from the forest or if the forest communities were uplanders. And in lieu of providing compulsory labor to the forest department, they were allowed as a matter of concession to cultivate, to provision themselves. But they were not provided land titles. So the forest department continued to be the owner of the land, while the Adivasis and a small number of non-Adivasis as well, who lived in these forest villages, were basically tenant farmers who lived under constant fear of summary eviction by the forest department. And there were more than 2,500 such forest villages established in central India. So taking forest villages as a very sharp marker of exploitation and oppression, I now move to the larger question that I asked, which is how have Adivasis in central India engaged with the power asymmetries in which they are enmeshed? And more specifically, the question I ask here is what is the role that food and cropping patterns have played in this engagement? So I come to the Maikal Hills of Madhya Pradesh in central India. So that's represented by this little red ellipse in the map of India on the right. The Maikal Hills are largely inhabited by Bega and Gond Adivasis, and I refer to a particular region called Bega Chak, which has a population of about 35,000 Bega and Gonds. These are historically dispossessed people. I mean, they've been living in these forests for a long time, but they were forced to confine themselves to the forest villages from the late 19th century onwards. So, although they've been living there for several generations, they were not provided land titles, and therefore they are dispossessed in that sense. And they are dependent upon the forest for a livelihood, and they also carry out subsistence farming. So they farm basically to provision the household and not to sell crops. Historically, they were swidden cultivators, and as swidden cultivators, they grew a range of about 18 to 24 different crops, but that has changed, as we will see shortly. And this study is based on ethnographic fieldwork in this region over a long period of time, and most recently from 2021 onwards. So let me move to the onset of the 21st century, the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, which is popularly remembered as the culmination of an age of bhukmari, or hunger and anxiety. And this was a time that spanned at least the last quarter of a century, ending in the early 2000s, when people did not have enough food to eat, and often skipping at least one meal a day, going hungry to bed, not finding enough food in the forest, not being able to grow enough food on their own farms. The reason being that both the forests and farmlands had degraded as a result of sustained timber extraction for almost over a century in this region. So this had made native species, which were the fundamental providers of food, grow locally extinct. And it had also created a situation where, because of sustained settled cultivation in a region where the soil and the terrain were not suitable for it, the fertility of soil had declined to such an extent that the number of crops that people could grow had dropped to 6. And even these 6 crops were faced with a situation of diminishing productivity. So they were increasingly growing less food than the previous years. So this was a situation of the simple reproduction squeeze as Bernstein talks about. So you have a situation where the household is unable to reproduce itself. And in this particular case, the only way that they could do so was by consuming less every year. So in this situation of hunger and anxiety produced by the worry of provisioning the household in the forthcoming year, we had the Manrega, the Manrega scheme, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and the scheme that came from it, which was implemented in this region from 2006 onwards. And one of the activities that Manrega made possible was something that is locally called Samtalikaran and Medbandan, that would mean leveling of the land and construction of a bund. And in brief, I call this LLB, short for land leveling and bunding. So what this entails is essentially, in a sloping field, you can cut away at the soil, make the land relatively flat, and use that soil to construct an embankment around the field. And this makes it possible for rainwater to stagnate and therefore increases percolation. And most importantly, it makes it possible for the farmer to grow a crop which is more water intensive. And in this matrix, the most likely crop that farmers were bound to grow was paddy. And I'll come to that in a moment. So what LLB did was to increase the productivity of land in this region. So as you can see from the table, land which grew millets of up to 400 kilograms per acre now was able to grow paddy, which was at least double that quantity. So going up to often 3 or 4 times of what they could produce when they were growing millets. So this entailed a shift from millets to paddy, especially high-yielding paddy varieties, which require a lot of water and which they could not grow previously because water did not stagnate and did not percolate into the soil. So let me just quickly lead you through a series of pictures which show what LLB is all about. So this is a standard field. It is sloping. It's hard to plow because when the oxen turn around and start growing uphill, they are actually going against the slope. And as a result, you can see the oxen are very weak and there is very high oxen mortality. So there are no bunds in any of these fields. So water tends to run off and carry the topsoil along with it. Now, this is a field on which LLB has been carried out. So some of the soil has been excavated and it has been used to construct an embankment. And what this results in is something like this. So you see water stagnating in the field. And now this is ploughing going on for sowing paddy, which would not have been possible earlier. And this is a crop of paddy which is about 20 days old. So what we see is that through Manrega, there was a shift from millets to paddy because Manrega made certain resources available to the forest villagers of the Michael Hills, which enabled them to increase their productivity in a bid to overcome food insecurity. Sorry. Now, this was not something very straightforward. It involved a period of struggle. It involved several years and considerable lobbying by people in the Michael Hills. And I have here a quote from someone who was a sarpanch of one of these forest villages called Ajgar, who was one of these sort of pioneers of getting LLB done in his village through Manrega. Now, LLB is an activity that can possibly lead to high leakage of funds because it's very easy to inflate the extent of labor involved, and therefore district authorities were instructed from above to discourage the use of Manrega for LLB. Instead, they were asked to focus on activities such as road construction or construction of ponds, which were more also sort of communal activities or activities carried out in the commons, rather than LLB, which is sort of a private activity because it is carried out in individual fields. However, over time, the demand for LLB started increasing from below, and Ajgar Panchayat was one of the pioneers in this regard. LLB started being implemented with greater vigor because this sarpanch made extra efforts to grease the palms of the block officials above him to include LLB as an activity under Manrega. And once this started happening in Ajgar, neighboring villages also started demanding LLB in their own villages, leading to an increase in demand, a very high increase in demand, which made it difficult for elected representatives to say no to LLB. And therefore, this gave a fillip to the spread of land leveling and bunting across this region. So what I've said so far refers to the anxiety arising from hunger or food insecurity as a prime reason for the shift from millets to paddy. But that's only half the story. The other half of the story comes from a latent sense of aspiration, a latent sense of preference for rice. And I try to explain here why that is and how that actually worked. So one of the key markers of the distinction between the uplanders, that is the forest villagers, and the lowlanders, who are both Adivasi and non-Adivasi, with the non-Adivasi being socially dominant, is food. And within food, it is the diet, which is millet-based in the uplands and rice-based in the lowlands, which really drives this distinction. So millet, the consumption of millets has been a reference to the social inferiority of the uplanders. So the uplanders were frequently referred to as the people who eat millets and therefore are wild and therefore are prone to alcohol, prone to lack of civilization. And this marker has been there for a very long time. But from the late 90s onwards, we see an increased social interaction between the uplanders and lowlanders as roads and communication facilities improved. And therefore, this historically oppressive social meaning that was invested in millet started acquiring renewed significance. So uplanders always had this notion that rice is something, which confers social respectability on you. It was a marker of also of social status and social mobility. But they did not have the wherewithal, the resources to grow rice in their fields because the terrain and the soil did not support it. And you needed considerable resources to be able to prepare your fields to be able to grow rice or paddy. And Manrega made this possible. So Manrega fit into this sort of niche. And therefore, although it appears as if it was just the need to overcome food insecurity that drove the shift from paddy to millet, from millet to paddy, it was actually a latent aspiration, a latent sense of cultural hierarchy that had been internalized by people living in the uplands, which contributed to this shift. The other important way in which aspiration fed into this shift was somewhat unwittingly through the expansion of school infrastructure or education infrastructure in this region, both in the uplands and the lowlands. So from the late 1990s onwards, the state started investing heavily in constructing new schools and hostels in the lowland villages. And Adivasi children had to, after finishing primary school, had to move to the lowlands and live in hostels there to be able to continue their education. A very large number of Adivasi children who were the first generation of schoolgoers in their families made this temporary shift to the lowlands for the sake of their education. And here they came under the tutelage of teachers who were mostly non-Adivasi, who they also formed peer groups, mixed peer groups with upper caste schoolmates, which was not possible in their forest villages. And this led to a sort of a mixing of values, a sort of internalization of the social inferiority that non-Adivasi communities ascribe to the Adivasis. And one of the ways in which this marker of distinction was made especially prominent was in the form of diet. In schools, the diet in the midday meals is predominantly rice and wheat based. So if Adivasi children were going to school, they were being fed a diet of rice and wheat. And if they were living in hostels in the lowlands, they were eating rice and wheat all the time, because that is what they were being fed for dinner, for breakfast, on holidays, and so on. So when the Adivasi children came back to their villages, they became the prime movers of dietary change within their households. So the nature of education in this region is also such that it emphasizes a way of life that is sort of a marker of, treated as a marker of being superior to the kind of lives that Adivasis lead. And thus, aspiration worked in two ways, not only in the form of a latent ascription of social superiority to rice, but also through the kind of interaction that took place, especially with the expansion of education infrastructure. So that brings me to the summary and further to concluding thoughts. So broadly, one could say that the Adivasis of the Meghal Hills in these forest villages transitioned from millets to rice, primarily because of a prevailing state of food insecurity, and they tried to address their anxieties arising from hunger through this dietary, through this shift in cropping pattern, as well as the change in diet. However, not merely anxiety, but also aspiration played an important role in this shift. And this happened because rice was seen as something that conferred respectability and upward social mobility on the residents of these forest villages. And in this matrix of anxiety and aspiration, state resources in the form of Manrega and education infrastructure played an extremely important role. So dietary shift from the point of view of the residents of these forest villages themselves has been a key means of advancing their autonomy and engaging with power asymmetry. So for example, now that they are relatively more food secure, they are no longer reliant on working for the forest department to derive an income from which they could partly provision their household. They are in that sense relatively freer from the oppression of the forest department. They no longer have to take loans from money lenders at usurious rates of interest. So from their point of view, one could argue that internalizing such narratives of social superiority and inferiority is one way of engaging with power structures, because they enable them to challenge these narratives. However, this also exposes them to precarity in other ways. So they may have become relatively more food secure, but perhaps they are nutritionally poorer now, nutritionally more insecure. And secondly, what this case perhaps suggests is that there is to some extent an uncritical acceptance of the social norms and values that create and sustain the existing social and cultural hierarchies in this region in the first place, the distinction between the Adivasis and the non-Adivasis in particular. So I will end with these thoughts. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all panelists. That was very interesting and quite a diverse set of papers, looking at three quite different with quite different focuses on the PDS and what we did in Kashmir, to adolescent girls, in Nepal, which is really quite a neglected, research on adolescent girls is quite neglected with respect to food and nutrition and cultures and how from the perspective of public nutrition. So that's really useful that we have that. And also, the third paper looking at like the cultural changes and dietary changes and agrarian changes happening in the Mica Hills. So I just had a few comments and questions of my own before we move on to questions that we have on YouTube. So I just had like a thought on Babar's paper. Of course, we see the ways in which the PDS really contributes to the reconfiguration of agrarian systems. And that's really interesting from a historical perspective. Also looking at, what the radical land reforms did in this space. And as you say, the aspect to the relation to food self-sufficiency and independence certainly seems to be under-investigated, as much of the focus has been on, the redistributive benefits of the land reforms. And also Kashmir comes across to be as quite unique to other states, given the whole angle of dependency, which we really don't see so much in other states with respect to the PDS, this whole notion that the PDS has made the state dependent and the population dependent on food grain imports into the state. And also you seem to present really interesting associations between the food subsidy policy of the governments and land use changes and agrarian transformations to horticulture and to kind of growing fruit orchards and so on. But my question was, and you kind of link these two, you say that the food subsidy really led to this, really contributed very significantly to this shift away in land use change to horticulture and fruit orchards. So I was wondering whether it would not be also expected that the changing land use and shift away from food grain production would be, in some senses inevitable. So that was just a question I had, given that much larger profits are to be made from horticulture or production of fruits and dry fruits. And then I had a related question on the PDS in Kashmir, which is what the PDS really means in terms of basic food security in a region of conflict. I mean, given now that Kashmir has experienced serious instability for several decades, in such a context where economic opportunities and so on are also quite fragile, does not the PDS also serve a function of income transfer and basic food security in the current time? So that's just a question that I had. And then I had a question on Joanna's paper. As I said, it's really interesting to have this focus on adolescence as a category from the perspective of cultural ideas on food and intra-household distributions. As we said, much of the work has tended to look at very young children. So it's really great that we have this on adolescent girls. So one thought and question that I was wondering, which I had, was really on what the nutrition implications of the findings might be for adolescent girls. I mean, this really came to mind because I think there was 2 decades ago quite a lot of interest on intra-household allocations of nutrition in South Asia. And there were a lot of reviews also done on what research was out there. And I think this is quite a difficult topic to really study because, of course, observing and really looking at nutritional intakes is quite challenging. But the reviews of that time seem to find that like discrimination in intra-family feeding practices did exist, but it was really not quite so dramatic. So I was wondering whether, and also that they seem to kind of conclude that the discrimination in feeding did not necessarily kind of mean that, discrimination in nutrition. So I was just wondering if there was any further data that you might have on looking at nutritional status of boys and girls and whether, the fact that girls were eating nutritionally less rich foods, whether that had any implications for nutritional status. And then just one other quick question that I had was on methods, which was really about, like, of course, from what I understand, this material is mainly from interviews and group discussions. And I was wondering if you also had some data from observation, because from what I understand, again, is that especially with respect to food, there's often quite a lot of discrepancies between what people say and believe and what they actually do with regards food. So I was wondering whether there was any other observational data as well on discrimination in food allocations. Yeah, so those were really the main questions that I had. Venkat, I found that really, really interesting. It's great that to understand your work a little more in detail. I'm sorry I haven't had the chance to read the paper before. But I was really wondering, in terms of like the food security that you mentioned, that the changes in agrarian practices and the growing of rice, from what I understand, has really increased the food security in this region. But here, just in this context, what is really has been the role of the PDS? Because I understand that in many Adivasi areas, when people have moved and changed their agrarian practices, they've really moved to soya and not so much to rice. So it was really interesting to look at, because rice they were getting from the PDS. So it would be really interesting to understand what the role of the PDS has been in food security in this region. So thank you very much. And we also had a lot of questions, I think, on YouTube, which I think Luke is collating. So if we could maybe just get a brief response and then get on to the questions we have from YouTube.
Would you like me to respond first?
That would be great.
Yeah, thanks so much for your questions. Yeah, in regards to the observation data, so Neha spent a lot of time in the areas, and she collected the data, and she's Maithili and lives very close to the areas where we collected the data, and we did go to the field, and we didn't collect the observation data in a very rigorous way. We're very concerned about rigor in public health, and so, but you can see if you go to snack shops who is there. You can see who is wandering around the community, who is there. So I think that we were quite sort of sure about some of our findings. But I do agree with you. If we had done some observation and some data collection with boys, would have been great. So I think that my data actually, showed up more questions really, and the real need to sort of ask more questions about adolescent nutrition. I think in terms of your question around sort of nutritional status, so we do find that girls anemia is higher than boys, and so there are lots of different drivers of anemia. I've done some research in anemia in pregnancy, so it's not like a straightforward link between eating better and anemia outcomes, but certainly it can affect. So we do see those differentials there among boys and girls, and certainly the systematic reviews and literature has shown that there is gender disparities in household food distribution in this context, and also in South Asia, and that's not necessarily explained by sort of physiological effort, if you like. So, for example, men being out in the fields doing more work than women, it's not reflected in how much they eat. So women are still eating less, and less good quality food as well. So eating last and less is really common in this context. And my research with newly married women really shows, some of them being teenagers, really shows that if there's no food left in the pot, they don't cook more. They eat salt and chili. So that's really common in this context. So I think that it really, yeah, the sort of literature supports a need that girls are undernourished, and they have more nutritional need because of menstruation, and because of they start childbearing more early in this context. So yeah, we do need to focus on boys and girls, but yeah, girls have this extra need, I think. Yeah, I hope that answered your questions.
Yes, thank you.
So can I go next?
Sure. Yes.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So to answer your question, Devanshi, so the PDS does play a very important role in this story. I had to sort of cut it out because of paucity of time. But so Manrega came first, but what happens in that same decade, the first decade of the 2000s or the 21st century, is that there is also a strengthening of the PDS. So the PDS was there, but people hardly got the rations from the ration shop because it was mostly pilfered or diverted. So, but you see, even if you include the PDS and account for it in the story, there are two factors. One is, yes, so the PDS supplies can sustain a household of say 5 people for about 1 week. That's all. People work, do a lot of manual labor, so they eat a lot. So if they were to rely on just PDS, it would not really suffice. But it does contribute to the overall food security. And along with the PDS, the ICDS has also strengthened again in that same period. So for a household which has children below the age of 6, 1 meal a day is taken care of by the Anganwadi. Likewise, if a household with school-going children, 1 meal a day for the children is taken care of by the school. So you see a strengthening of a number of state schemes, PDS and ICDS, which were pre-existing, and Manrega, which was a new scheme. So they do contribute to the story, but they cannot explain everything. They just relying on these schemes would not suffice. So in that sense, the shift from millet to paddy has played a very important role in people's lives. There's a question in the chat box. Can I take it up now, or should I take it up later?
Yeah, maybe we could just get Babar, and then we'll get a question from Thomas, and then we'll get into the chat box and the questions on YouTube.
Thank you, Divanshi, for the feedback. And like the whole aim of my paper was actually to look at how sort of land reforms, why they did not lead to self-sufficiency question. And I was primarily arguing that the food aid in the region was central to that because it sort of disincentivizes the local farmers. And I agree with you that it's a unique case because much of the literature has looked at nutrition, accessibility, and all those issues, but like there are not much work on the angle of dependency, especially how food aid is used as in the politics of dependence. And regarding your question that it's inevitable, yes, it's inevitable given the way the states have promoted cash crops, and especially since the new liberalization of agriculture in India. But in the context of Kashmir, we have seen severe implications in recent times because Kashmir is a landlocked region and there's a huge cost to import food grains from outside region. And at the same time, because of the conflict in the region, the local population is vulnerable at the time of when there are hartals and curfews in the region because most of the highways are blocked, which like the supply gets blocked there. And if you look at the recent food sovereignty debates, there have been like promoting local food systems because even in the context of Kashmir, we are seeing dietary changes, which has led to the rise of disease as well as ecological issues. So that's why like I'm a little bit critical of food subsidy in the region, especially looking at how in a frontier zone, food aid is primarily being used in terms of creating dependence in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe we can take questions we have on YouTube, and maybe first we can go to Thomas. I can see your hand up.
I think Suchismita's question was in the chat before mine, so if she wants to ask ahead of me, I don't mind.
Let's just go with you since we've come to you, and I'll look at that question.
Thank you. They were all really interesting questions. I really liked your presentation, Venkat, and I feel like you're telling another side of the story, and my ethnography is maybe just the tip of the iceberg that you're discussing. I think we share this interest in how the state policies have slightly ironically affected consumption habits and everyday life in parts of the subcontinent that are often thought of as being very isolated from state contact. So there's a lot in common. And I just wanted to ask you on an empirical question, the work that's done to level off those fields and to bound the field with the soil that is leveled out, how are families or fields or sections of land selected for that process? Do individual household heads have to apply for that, or is that like a blanket policy that got implemented? So there were a lot of like empirical questions. I also really like the way you emphasized how schooling and education produces cultural ideas that then come back to the village. So I think we could like maybe say a bit more about the dialectic process of ideas moving back and forth between households, families and villages and these larger public institutions. And I also had a question for Joanna about this word that came up right at the end of your presentation, which was decision makers, which I think I also observed in my field work the wide gender inequality, and I alluded to it very briefly at the beginning, but who eats first, who eats the leftovers, and in times of food scarcity in my setting, we actually end up with a situation where people don't have anything to make a curry with. They just have salt and chili powder, which are added to rice if there's a little bit of rice, and that's it's like a very stark image, I think, of food poverty. And I wondered if I could ask you more about like the decision-making process, that because you presented it in a way which is really fascinating, how people have, a lot of the young women have really imbibed that idea of their own sense of, I don't know, is inferiority the right word? They don't have the same status as the boys, so they will accept like that it's completely normal for their diet to be so much less nutritious. But at what point in the kind of chain of food consumption is that decision being made by those individuals, or is it something that is a wider kind of cultural schema? So I just wanted to ask about decision making and how that reality becomes so almost impenetrable. Like the picture you presented was quite a total, like, gender imbalance. It's very similar in my field. So I think it's even more so as people adopt more patriarchal ways in which families are organized, I think. So yeah, thank you all.
Venkat?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Thomas, for those observations and very interesting questions. And I was indeed thinking of your work a lot in the course of preparing my slides. So we do have very interesting sort of overlap and things to learn from each other. To respond to your question, the first question is fairly sort of straightforward. The way these fields are selected is, yes, individually, the head of the household has to submit an application in writing to the Gram Panchayat, and it's a sort of it's not a very smooth process. So it depends on how in a village of Adivasis, there is still stratification. There are still some who are sort of dominant, closer to the levers of power, and so on. So that does play a role. So which is also a reason why LLB has not really reached its potential in this region. They could have done a lot more had there really been a push for it. But in a way, maybe that is good, because that will lead me to the response to the question in the chat box. So I'll leave that for later. So, but broadly speaking, individually households have to apply, and then whether they get selected or not is in the hands of the panchayat representative. So there is some politics there, and therefore not all fields which are deserving get funds from Manrega for LLB in any particular year. And there are cases where some households may be willfully neglected or denied on some grounds or the other. The second question is slightly more sort of tricky. I've not really put much thought to that. So I was actually looking at young people or the younger generation. I was interested in them primarily because they were the drivers of migration from the hills to the plains. And that's a different aspect of the story. And then, so for example, I realized that if you had studied in a lowland school, you were likely to have made connections with non-Adivasis who acted as labor contractors, and therefore through them you got to know that there's this place that you can go to. And migration is also aspirational. So it's like you want to, having spent your time in the lowlands, you are exposed to media, you're exposed to a way of life, to pictures and videos of the city which look really grand, and you want to experience a slice of that life, and therefore you migrate. So, and it was through that that element which led me to aspiration, and which sort of introduced me to the fact that aspiration also works in this particular case. So that's a question that I will need to explore. But thanks very much for asking it, and it really makes me feel that I need to be spending more time on that. Thank you.
So maybe Joanna, and then we've got a couple of questions in the chat here, and I think there's a couple on YouTube. So we'll take them all together after we've got Joanna.
Yeah, thanks very much for your questions. I think that the sort of decision maker category in it's applied very widely. I think obviously boys have more capacity to make decisions because they have economic resources in this context. So, they can choose much more because they actually have money, whereas we saw girls didn't have access to financial resources. And we see that also within households played out, across the generations of women in this context. They don't have access to any money, so they find it difficult to take decisions about how that money is spent. My PhD student did a great PhD. If you want to read it, it's fantastic, about sort of women's empowerment in this context. And he really tried to unpack the sort of money management. And I think that, that often the mother-in-law is kind of managing the money, but and she gives it to the male household members to go and spend, and then adolescents can move outside the household, but as girls get older they can move less, and so therefore their ability to spend any money, even if they had it, gets restricted. So I think that of course, these adolescent girls were furious about their situation. They don't accept it. I think they, and I think that we see social change. I think Venkat's kind of presentation of how the adolescents took the food culture back into the household. There is capacity for change, and I think that we can help adolescents, change their situation. But I think we can't do that just by engaging with them alone. We need to engage with the broader structures, I guess. We found when we did some data collection about inter-household food allocation, there was a fantastic researcher called Helen Harris Fry, who's done a lot of work to make a food atlas that's culturally appropriate. It's also publicly available. Please, everyone, use it if you want to work in this context. And she actually did a very detailed analysis of what happened in poor households and how food was allocated. And we find that the women and the mothers-in-law lose out when there's less food, and that clearly came through in the data. So yeah, I think there's also, there's the impact of context is obviously really important, because there's a little tiny bit of literature, from urban areas, which shows that fathers give their daughters money. And so we didn't capture that in our data, but maybe, maybe it's happening. So I think there's so much more research to be done with adolescents and understanding how they eat and, how they can be supported to eat better. Yeah, I hope that answers your questions.
Thanks, both of you. Thanks.
So we had a couple of questions in the Zoom chat box. So maybe we can go with Suchismita first, and then take the question from Carla, and then we'll move to the YouTube questions. So Suchismita?
Hi, thank you everyone. This was a really lovely panel, and I got to engage with some of the things very closely. So thank you very much for all your succinct presentation. So my question was to Venkat, and because in the previous panel, we were also discussing about how state as an institution also affects food policies and and consumption patterns. And where in your presentation, you were talking about aspirations and the aspiration towards rice, from millet. And this year, the Indian government has declared millet to be like the superfood, and there is a lot of attempt to popularize millet. So I was wondering, what implication do these government measures, state measures have over communities who earlier were consuming millet and then changed to rice, again, because of PDS aspirations, and rice at one point was also popularized. So just wanted to hear your thoughts about this shift in consumption in that sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Suchismita. That's a very interesting question. And I begin by sort of reminded of the police in Hindi movies. They always come late at the scene of crime or murder. So the Indian government waking up to millets and saying 2023 will be the year of millets is actually a decade behind the popularity of millets. I mean, the de facto popularity of millets in say Indian society, at least urban India. So sort of 2012 in this region was a sort of a watershed year, because that was the year the traders who always used to buy forest products from the Adivasis now said, no, we come and sell your kodo and kutki. And that really disrupted that hierarchy that existed, but only to a certain extent, because the lowlanders and most Adivasis still, they do not want to consume millets. They're happy selling it, but they really don't want to eat it themselves. But that is in a state of flux now, because there is now in the last 3 or 4 years, and especially after the pandemic, at least in this part of Madhya Pradesh, a growing emphasis from the state on encouraging millets and so on. But that is going hand in hand with the expansion of green revolution technologies. So for example, the state also asks farmers to grow more than one crop. So these are people who grow one rain-fed crop. And that is considered backward, and that is one of the ways in which power asymmetries are expressed or manifest. So by carrying out LLB, the state also is telling the Adivasi farmer, okay, so now your field is terraced and bundled, so now you should start growing 2 crops. So now if you start growing 2 crops, what this means is that you cannot grow millets for 2 reasons. One, millets need a field which is slightly sloping and where water does not stagnate. So the moment you sort of terrace it and bundle it, you can only grow paddy. The other reason is that also in some cases where the job is poorly done, so then the field is still sloping. This is not intentional, it's just because the quality of work is poor. So then you can still grow millets and maybe also grow paddy. But there, if you want to grow 2 crops, then you have to grow a crop which matures in time for the second crop to be sown. So if you want to continue with the traditional varieties of millets that they have been sowing, they tend to mature well into January or February. By then it is too late for a second crop. So there are all these factors which are, at play out there, and it remains to be seen. So it's a situation in great flux. So it's not something that one can say for sure that this is what is happening. There are many things happening. And I mean, here maybe I should link up with Thomas's question. So the fact that individually people have to apply for land leveling to the panchayat, and the fact that the panchayat has its own politics, meaning that some fields are left unleveled and unbundled, actually is a sort of blessing from that point of view, because then you can continue to grow millets on that field, and therefore you do see certainly the popularity of millets has increased. So there are Adivasi farmers, even younger generation Adivasi farmers, who believe that yes, millets are good. How far that is, I mean, if you take a percentage, I don't know how far that is, because it's changing. And so people are also moving to, more and more water intensive varieties of paddy. So that's also happening. And you're also seeing some farmers saying, no, let's go back to millets. And then you're also seeing the state trying to introduce high yielding varieties of millets. But so far they have not been successful. They are completely out of sync with the the ecological conditions, the soil conditions of that region. So yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
So we have 2 more questions, and then we have 5 minutes left before we finish this panel. So I'm going to ask Carla very quickly if she has a question.
So I think Joanna and maybe Thomas, maybe you've already touched upon this a little bit, but I was kind of just wondering what the the infrastructural landscape is of this Nepalese region that you're working in. You had mentioned this idea of snack shops where these practices of eating are taking place, particularly by young male adolescents, and then also these like nutritional deficiencies. It had been touched upon, Devanshi, I think, by you as well a little bit. Is there actual nutritional food in the region that is whose access to is being limited for the women, or is it really just like a lack of quantity?
Thanks for your question. It's so the Terai, so the plains of Nepal are known as the breadbasket of Nepal. They are very fertile. It's where all the rice is produced. But yet the population living in the plains are the worst nourished. We have bad nutrition, poor nutrition in the west of Nepal, in the hills and mountains where the issues that you're talking about are huge. There's not actual access to vegetables. There isn't enough water to grow things. So we have huge issues there in the west and the hills and mountains. But that's what's so kind of surprising and awful about the situation of women, particularly in the Terai, is that they live in this fertile ground, but they're undernourished. And I think, obviously there's political factors there. The plains area has been politically marginalized for a long time. We had migration of the people from the hills coming to the Terai who were incentivized to migrate. There was, landlords having large, large areas, and people kind of wanted to work on that land. So, so I think that there's a lot of issues in the kind of the food system in terms of nutrition, but we do see that there is access, like people do grow some vegetables around their households. They could have micronutrient dense diets. It is possible. Helen has done a lot of work on kind of seasonal, what's seasonal and what's the best for nutrition, particularly around pregnancy, women in pregnancy, but it's the same for adolescent girls, I'm sure.
I'm sorry, I have to come in. We just have 2 minutes more on the session, and one last question to take. So I'm really sorry, Joanna.
I'll finish there. Yeah, I'll finish there. Carla, I'm happy to speak to you afterwards.
So the question we had from Rohini, James, could you read that out? Because I don't have access to it. Just
happy to read it.
Yes.
Rohini asks, have the gradual changes in food policy / politics in J&K reinforced post-colonial center-periphery power relations between India and its peripheries that perhaps led to the erosion of J&K's self-autonomy?
Babar?
You're muted, Barbara, but I think we've only got a minute left. So, but if you like, we can give you a minute when you come back we can let you think about that question perhaps over lunch and come back to it. Sorry to interrupt. I'm just worried that we'll suddenly be cut off. I'm not quite sure how this works. But yeah, thank you all for, again, another great set of papers. I also had lots of questions that I wanted to ask, but hopefully we'll have some time at the very end of the day to catch up on some of those, if we catch up a little bit on time as we go along. I'm also to remind you that this link, when it closes, we have a different link for this afternoon. So to come back, if you're on Zoom, to the new link. For those of you who are looking on YouTube, you also have a new link, which if you've registered on Eventbrite, you should have been sent that. Otherwise, I will retweet it again at Brunel South Asia. It's also in the chat on YouTube, in the current chat. I cut and pasted it to there. So hopefully it will be accessible. And hopefully we will see you all again at 13:45. Actually, if you want to come onto the Zoom, this Zoom chat, Zoom, whatever this bit's called, at about, I don't know, from about 13:30 would be good. And then we'll go live again. The live stream will begin dead on 13:45. And we've got two more exciting panels to look forward to. So yeah, great. Thank you all very much for your contributions this morning.